Leaks were just the beginning. They went on to post more than 90,000 leaked documents known as the Afghan war logs, 390,000 documents known as the Iraq war logs, and 250,000 private messages between diplomats called cables in what is now known as Cablegate. These leaks were met with very real ethical questions.
The problem with publishing those cables was that a number of confidential sources for U.S. diplomats who faced real danger when their names were exposed.
Then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton drove the point home that
every country, including the United States, must be able to have candid conversations about the people and nations with whom they deal.
Shortly after Cablegate, the Swedish government issued an arrest warrant for Assange on allegations of rape and molestation. He claimed the allegations were fabricated to get him extradited to the United States, a claim the U.S. government denied. Either way, Assange's next move was
to seek refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy, which really was the beginning of the new chapter in his life and what we're dealing with now, which is him being stuck in London.
What was supposed to be an office in an embassy is now Assange's self-imposed prison to this very day. But that doesn't mean he's slowed down. Since being trapped at the embassy, WikiLeaks has released files about Guantanamo Bay prisoners, Syrian political figures, and the draft to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then came the 2016 U.S. election.
Thousands of leaked emails showed Democratic Party officials possibly plotting against Bernie Sanders in his race against Hillary Clinton.
Over the course of 68 days, WikiLeaks released 20,000 confidential Democratic National Committee emails. In terms of the presidential race, if you look right here, when Assange released the first batch of emails, Trump actually takes his first lead against Clinton.
I think we've had enough of the Clintons, in all fairness.
Once WikiLeaks started exposing secrets of the Democratic Party, Julian Assange became a hero to many on the right. Public opinion kind of flip-flopped.
WikiLeaks.
From the emails, we now know Hillary Clinton's campaign manager makes risotto, and also how the DNC squashed Bernie Sanders' campaign. One thing we don't know is who gave Assange the stolen emails in the first place.
Many leading Democrats say they suspect it was the Russians. They released an analysis from a private cybersecurity firm that had said it was the Russians.
But Assange claims
our source is not the Russian government, and it is not a state party.
So this is where we stand today. The public still doesn't know who provided the emails to WikiLeaks. Meanwhile, Assange is still running WikiLeaks and still releasing documents. In March 2017, he started publishing documents from the CIA's Center for Cyber Intelligence called Vault 7.
The CIA, the agency charged with finding and keeping our top secrets, can't keep its own secrets.
As long as Assange has a connection to the world, no government secret will be too far from exposure.
Julian Assange is still in the embassy. Maybe he'll leave, maybe he won't. Kind of regardless, his work has been done. He's changed the way people think about their governments, about their own secrets, about their own hackability, and really the world has changed because of him.
expose everything you won't admit.
And action.
This entire video is based on a true story. When I do like motivational speeches or even tell myself like, love yourself and you should love yourself.
This is Lily Singh. But to fans all over the world, she's the YouTube star Superwoman.
What if everyone's a girl?
Superwoman. I know we can change the world for the better, one positive day at a time. My parents now know what I do. They didn't know what I did for a long time in the beginning of my career. I was just making videos in my room. They had no idea.
Mom, Dad, have you seen my keys? I can't find them anywhere. Because you're always on phone.
Until someone called them, like a family member from another part of Canada was like, Canada, is your daughter making videos? And the mom was like, I don't know, Lily, are you making videos?
Just making videos grew into an entire career. Today, Lily's YouTube channel has some 12 million subscribers, over 2 billion views, and guest stars like Michelle Obama, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and Seth Rogen.
I think a lot of young girls are raised to believe that you're going to go to school and then graduate and then get married and then get a job and have kids.
And Lily was on that path, all the way through a psychology degree at York University in Toronto. But when she started thinking about a career,
I started to immensely panic and think something was wrong with me because I tried to figure out my life and it wasn't working in that straight line.
It was 2010, and YouTube was only 5 years old.
I thought nothing of YouTube. I was probably the last person in my circle of friends to discover YouTube. And I remember when I did, I thought, this is so strange. There's people making videos in their rooms, and other people are watching them.
So she figured, why not give it a shot?
I one day posted a video because I was sad, and I wanted to be creative and happy.
She didn't know how to edit video or write scripts, so she winged it.
It was so bad and so cringe, and my expectation was literally nothing. I was like, I'm gonna put this video up, a couple of my friends are gonna watch it, probably make fun of me, and that's gonna be the end of this. The second and third video came from, wait, 70 people watched my first one, can I get 80 to watch the next one?
She kept creating, she kept posting, and the viewers kept coming. Lily had found an audience.
A lot of the comments were, oh my God, there's a brown girl on YouTube.
More specifically, Indian. Lily's parents immigrated to Canada from India, and Lily was born and raised in Scarborough, near Toronto.
My home life was awesome. My parents, even though I portrayed them to be quite strict in my videos.
Oi, Lily, wear the rest of your skirt, huh? I teach you like this, to walk around like this, showing everything to everyone.
They actually aren't like that at all. They're pretty modern and pretty cool.
Your dress is short. Don't know what for.
And were pretty lenient with me. I mean, I got away with a lot of things. I was a brat. I was a brat.
She had a different idea of what she wanted out of life than other kids. In a grade school graduation slideshow, her classmates said they wanted to be lawyers and doctors.
And then I came up and I was like, rapper.
Making out with your friends, man. But then you say that you hate hoes.
I could just feel my parents being like, why?
Because that's just not something women really did in the Singh family.
I know there was a ton of people that weren't happy about my birth being a female, so I think, and that's some real-ish, but it's a real thing. The best thing I could have done to prove to so many people that didn't want my mom to have a daughter was to become Superwoman.
What if everyone it's a girl, Superwoman?
It was the name of Lily's favorite hip-hop song by Lil Mo featuring Fabulous.
I love the song so much because it was one of the only songs at the time that was an empowering female song, where Lil Mo's going on about, like, I will save guys with my superpowers, and I will save girls with my superpowers, and I am the Superwoman. I thought, this name that I've had for so long that empowered me when I was younger, I'm gonna make this my screen name. Maybe this should be a new series.
Superwoman didn't just burst onto the scene overnight with a viral video. It was a steady climb fueled by hard work.
The moment that I thought this is going somewhere and this could be a career was the first time I performed internationally. It was in India. And it was the first time where I was truly across the world and people knew my videos.
Singh has transformed herself from a bratty kid to an internet personality to a media mogul. She started a feature film, A Trip to Unicorn Island, in 2016. And her book, How to Be a Boss, hit the New York Times bestseller list in 2017 while she was on a 30-city international tour. Lily started out with the goal of getting millions of subscribers and financial security.
Hurry the hell up.
But after surpassing those goals, success has new meaning.
I've really come to terms with the fact that my definition of success is what's the best legacy I can leave behind. And it's not the number of views, the number of subscribers. It is the number of people that can say, this girl changed my life or changed something in my life positively.
CTE is often found in the brains of deceased athletes, military veterans, and others with a history of repetitive brain trauma. Hundreds have donated their brains to the VA Boston University Concussion Legacy Foundation Brain Bank.
This is a former NFL player who died in his early 70s, and this is a veteran who also died in his early 70s.
Dr. Ann McKee dissects these brains.
The hippocampus and the mammillary bodies are very important for memory. I can see that they're slightly affected.
McKee recently dissected the brain of former New England Patriots player Aaron Hernandez, who was convicted of murder and later committed suicide.
You'll see right away that the brain is showing signs of shrinkage. You can see the crevices in the brain that you can't see in the normal.
McKee says Hernandez's severe case of CTE impacted his decision-making, depression, and ability to control rage and aggression. Right now, she thinks we're underestimating how many people have CTE.
We were able to distinguish between CTE and controls and CTE and Alzheimer's disease. The next question is, can we do this in the blood, and can we do this in living people? And we aren't there yet with those answers.
But the need for a diagnosis in the living is motivating companies such as Quanterix in Lexington, Massachusetts, to work faster on technology that could diagnose concussions and CTE in as few as 30 minutes. Kevin Rosovsky is the CEO.
It's like a high-powered microscope. And so by doing that, we can see little biomarkers that you couldn't see before in the blood.
Quanterix received a grant from the NFL and just went public. Since then, its stock is up more than 40%. The company sells a machine called Simoa for $175,000 to other biotechs, hospitals, and researchers.
And for the first time in history, we're able to see brain health in blood, and that's a major breakthrough, and that's leading to less invasive testing, and we've already been able to see evidence of concussions, and there's the beginning evidence of being able to see the accumulated effect of concussions.
Quanterix is also trying to detect Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, and ALS. Rosovsky says he thinks diagnosing concussions will be easier than diagnosing CTE.
Diagnosing CT in the living probably is a couple years away. We're real excited to see the progress, but reducing some of that work into actual tests in a laboratory takes time. There's regulatory approvals. There's a lot of red tape that you have to go through.
Also in this race to diagnose CTE in the blood are Athlon Medical and Exosome Sciences. And New York's Mount Sinai Hospital is scanning for the disease in the living. But it's just one step in a series of questions for those with serious head trauma. There's still no cure for CTE.
Even if we had a great idea for a treatment, there's no way to test whether it's effective or not. So that's the enormous advance that we'll get if we can develop a biomarker for this disease.
In Boston, Ann Mostu, Bloomberg News.
Wine is a $300 billion global industry where one person's opinion can make fortunes or break them. That's because of this man, Robert Parker, and his newsletter, The Wine Advocate. For 3 decades, he dominated as the world's most influential wine critic. Now Parker's protege is building an empire of his own. Antonio Galloni runs Venice.
Antonio, tell me, what are you trying to build at Venice?
Well, at Venice, we started with the idea in 2013 of building a world-class platform. We have a database of about 250,000 professionally written reviews. On Delectable, we have 7 million user reviews. Through Delectable, we also have a partnership with Whole Foods and several other partnerships that we can't announce just yet. And when you put that all together, what we have is something that no other company in our space can even come close to.
Do you think of yourself as the next Parker?
Not at all.
Why?
Because Steve Jobs said you can't live your life trying to be somebody else. So he's one of my biggest influences, and I've never wanted to be a replica of somebody else because a replica is never as good as the original. Bob is a genius, fantastic, one of a kind. We're going to be something completely different, and I have no desire to be some version of somebody else.
Different in what way?
Every decision that I've made at this company is completely anathemic to what Bob did with his company. I want our writers to be partners. All of my senior people are locked into the company. They all have equity or they have a path to equity based on business results. That's something that we never had at Parker. Our benefits are world-class, and everything that we've done at Venice is completely different from that model. When Steve Tanzer, who is the most experienced active wine critic in America, wants to work with us, that says something. When Alessandro Masnaghetti, who's the best cartographer of vineyards, wants to work with us, that says something. When Neil Martin, who's a superstar wine critic with enormous experience in Bordeaux and Burgundy and the former lead critic at The Advocate, wants to come and be part of our team, that says something.
You make it sound like The Wine Advocate was a disaster as a company and a miserable experience as an employee.
No, it was great because I got to work with Bob Parker when he was at his prime, you know, and Bob was like a second father to me, and we talked on the phone all the time, and he gave me great advice.
Can anyone's palate dominate the wine criticism business the way Parker's did? And should anyone's palate dominate it the way his did?
I just think the world is very different today. You know, it's just a totally different world. It's probably not healthy to have a single person dominating the world.
It's not even wine criticism, it's the wine industry.
Yeah, that's probably not the healthiest thing in the world. But I think that there's just such an opportunity right now with social media and technology to reach such a massive number of people that I think it's possible that 1 or 2 people will actually have more influence than Bob Parker did, because they will, again, this goes back to your first question, not trying to be a version of somebody else. You see this in sports all the time. It's like, oh, well, nobody will ever beat this record. And then somebody comes along, you know, it's like tennis, Pete Sampras. Nobody's ever going to win as many Grand Slams. I have 2 guys who are ahead of that and 1 knocking on the door. And so I think a lot like that.
You're a former investment banker. How does that inform and influence what you're doing and what you've done?
My generation has had to deal with a lot more challenges. That's why I think we're actually much better poised for the future. My first job in finance, the first thing that happened was long-term capital, 1998. Then the tech bubble melted down. Then there was a mutual fund trading scandal. You know, that was all like within about 5 or 6 years. And these are the things that I had to deal with as a young executive. My peers who were 20 years older didn't know how to manage in crisis. They'd only seen Black Monday. They'd just been in a big bull market. It's very different. So I'm very lucky. People of my generation or a little bit younger have actually had to deal with a lot more crises. I think that's actually good for learning how to cope with challenges in business.
From the outside, it kind of looks like you're trying to demolish the house that Parker built, right? You left The Wine Advocate.
Yeah.
You merged with one of his chief rivals.
Yeah.
And you just hired his successor, Neil Martin.
Mm-hmm.
So are you?
I think what that says is that all the best people want to work at our company. And that's really what we strive to create starting in 2013. We wanted to create a world-class company that would attract the best-in-class talent, and not just on the content side, on the technology side, on the digital side, our office, and at every level, what we're trying to, we only hire superstars, and we're looking for those superstars.
In the world of professional wrestling, there's something called a swerve.
Hulk Hogan has betrayed WCW!
Some examples. These tag team partners are called babyfaces, or the good guys. Then one of them swerves when he super kicks his tag team partner in the head, quickly assuming the role of the bad guy, or what the wrestling world calls the heel.
Are you kidding? What a despicable act that was!
Or a match is almost lost when, what's that? The superstar wrestler appears out of nowhere sprinting down the aisle to save the match.
That's the Warriors music! It's the Ultimate Warrior!
That's a swerve. So it should go as no surprise that World Wrestling Entertainment, known as the WWE, the most popular brand of sports entertainment in the world, is prepared for any swerves that come their way. So here's the story of how the WWE learned to see the swerve coming. So I spoke to Bloomberg reporters Felix Gillette.
I'm a writer for Bloomberg News for the global business team.
And Kim Basine.
And I'm the U.S. luxury reporter at Bloomberg.
To find out exactly how the WWE is positioning itself for an all-out global invasion, which starts with a massive change to their lucrative pay-per-view model.
WWE basically pioneered the pay-per-view model on cable. I remember as a kid, when the pay-per-view events came up, all of our friends would scramble around and try and get one of the parents to pay for it.
But in 2014, they took a huge risk.
They saw a little bit sooner than some of the other entertainment brands that where this whole thing was moving was away from cable and satellite television and towards on-demand streaming video apps. They made this risky decision, in essence, cannibalizing that pay-per-view model, which they had essentially built.
And after some early turbulence, it's working. Roughly 1.5 million people are paying $9.99 a month for the WWE app, making it the 5th most popular streaming OTT service. This adapt-or-die approach is in the WWE's DNA. Over the past 30 years, the company always seems to think 2 steps ahead. In the early 90s,
WWE was at its most threatened when Ted Turner took them on with WCW,
which stands for World Championship Wrestling. And back then, the WCW was winning the ratings war. So in order to compete with them,
WWE had changed its product from a family-friendly kind of cartoonish style to this really raw. That's why they called their show Raw. It was this raw style of wrestling.
With violent, outrageous, reality-inspired plot lines and aggressive personas.
From a 16-foot ladder!
And they won that fight against Ted Turner. And they bought WCW.
The early 2000s ushered in an era of testosterone-driven programming aimed at the red-blooded American male.
Bra and panties matches, and people smash each other over their head with like barbed wire bats and things like that.
Until 2015, when WWE fans started a hashtag #GiveDivas a Chance. Since then, WWE has hired 40 more female wrestlers, and that growing cast of female characters was part of a much larger plan.
They started to try to appeal to a broader set of people.
Let's attract more female fans. And after we've attracted more female fans, let's attract more international fans. They're broadening their base, and they're doing that in large part to make it more advertising friendly.
And not just friendly to advertisers.
They're trying to build up their fan base in China. They're trying to build up their fan base in Europe. They, already have a pretty good fan base in India.
India is a place where they already have an established wrestling culture.
Because of the gigantic Indian wrestler, the Great Khali. But there's still a lot of work to do. While the WWE set a revenue record in 2017, only 30% of it is coming from an overseas audience. And there's one person whose responsibility is to grow that number.
The buck eventually stops at Vince McMahon, no matter what's happening within WWE.
Yeah, he's a very controlling guy, and it's a very, very, very tightly scripted company.
And that goes all the way down the board to big stars' entrance music. And their outfits and things like that.
So with a CEO like McMahon always planning 2 moves ahead and an aggressive push into multiple international markets, a big issue is money.
It's hard to do all those things simultaneously without committing a huge amount of capital to it.
And that's where the WWE becomes an attractive company for buyers.
Potentially, one thing that could happen with WWE is they could benefit by being acquired by a bigger technology or telecom company, an Amazon or Facebook or a 21st Century Fox.
So with a market cap of $2.8 billion, the advantage of owning 100% of their own content, and a rapid consolidation spreading throughout the entertainment industry, it looks like the WWE is well positioned, even if there are swerves ahead.
Our world is changing. Every day, it changes a little faster. Some changes are too small to see. Others, too big to handle. Sometimes, change feels slow. So slow, we don't even notice. Other times, it happens all at once, and we can't keep up. For our climate, change means many things. And between too small to see and too big to handle, there is a whole world of difference. The clock is ticking. This is Bloomberg Green.
Saving the seas. This week, the deep-sea diver who stopped writing the ocean's obituary to find a solution. Enric Sala tells us why the next 10 years matter most. And globalization needs to get greener. Shipping accounts for nearly an eighth of all transport emissions. How can the industry clean up its act? Plus, protecting coastlines comes at a huge environmental cost. But one Israeli startup found a way to keep the sea out and the animals in. From London, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. After more than a decade of studying the ocean as an academic, Enric Sala realized he was writing the ocean's obituary. He quit his job and became a full-time conservationist. As an in-house explorer for National Geographic, he's clocked more than 5,000 open water dives. He's also founded Pristine Seas, a project that combines exploration, research, and media to lobby countries to protect their oceans. To date, it has helped create marine reserves equivalent to half the size of Canada. I spoke to him about his mission and why it's so urgent.
The state of the world's oceans is really bad. We have lost 90% of the large fish in the ocean. Sharks, groupers, cod, tuna. More than half of the fish stocks are overfished, which means that we are taking them out of the water faster than they can reproduce. More than half of the ocean is affected by industrial fishing, and global warming is killing coral reefs all around the world. The ocean is in a trajectory of decline.
Can you just visualize for our viewers who never get to see the kind of things you are able to see, what an ocean and healthy ecosystem looks like versus one that's next to a bustling economic and industrialized area?
Coral reefs in the United States, in the Florida Keys, are down to only 2% of what they used to be. Before, 80 to 90% of the bottom on a coral reef in the Caribbean was covered by live coral. Now, Florida Keys have only 2%. The average in the Caribbean is about 5% of the bottom covered by live coral. The rest is covered by slime and seaweed. And most of the fish you can see are this big. And it is very, very rare that if you jump into any place in the Caribbean at random, you see a shark. It's very, very rare. Now, let's go to Millennium Atoll, for example. An atoll that is uninhabited and fished south of the equator in the Central Pacific, belongs to the Republic of Kiribati. 2009, we conducted the first underwater expedition to this island, and I still remember the first time. Jumped over the side of the boat, and as soon as the bubbles cleared, I was surrounded by 15 gray reef sharks. After a couple minutes, the sharks decided that we were boring, and they went back to do their thing. And you look down, 90% of the seafloor is covered by thriving coral, and it's full of fish, and a sea turtle comes by. Now, this abundance that we rarely see anywhere except in well-managed marine reserves. This is what the ocean used to be like, and this is what we have learned from going to these pristine places.
And you write in your book that you're writing the obituary of ocean life. What's the cure?
The cure is doing less harm. Basically, there are three things that we are doing to the ocean. One is we are taking fish out of the water faster than they can reproduce. Two, we are turning the ocean warmer and more acidic because of man-made climate change. And three, we are throwing in everything that we don't want, our waste and our plastic. We need basically to reverse these trends.
Does this mean that a lot of this falls to governments and their policies?
That's a big part of it, because it is governments that regulate fishing and mineral extraction and oil extraction. It is governments that have the legal authority to create large marine reserves in the ocean. But also, local communities have an important role to play because some of the most successful protected areas in the ocean are community-led and community-managed marine reserves. So when the fish come back, the divers come in. And that creates huge economic opportunities through ecotourism. These areas that are managed by communities are very successful because the communities have a vested interest in having as many fish as possible inside them so they can enjoy the benefits.
What from the pandemic has changed your view when it comes to protection of the environment?
Nature has given us a very strong signal of how fast it can recover if we just give it space. Everybody was fascinated by all these videos of the whales and the dolphins coming into marinas and mountain lions on the streets of Santiago in Chile, wild goats in the UK. Nature has this extraordinary ability to bounce back if we just give it space. This is why we need to protect at least 30% of the planet by 2030.
How do healthy marine ecosystems help in the fight against climate change, though?
Most people see the ocean as a victim of climate change, but the ocean can also be a solution because we know that the more life that is in the ocean, like big fish and big whales, the more these organisms help to make the ocean productive and absorb more CO2. The kelp forest, seagrass beds, all of these are important ecosystems in the ocean that are similar to the forests on the land that capture a lot of our carbon pollutions.
What are you most excited about in your field?
We have 10 years to fix this problem. Global fisheries catch is going down, stocks are collapsing. Business as usual means that by 2050, 90% of the coral reefs are gone, that most commercial fisheries have collapsed. That affects food security, that affects a migration of people. We have 10 years to get to peak greenhouse gas emissions and then go carbon neutral by 2050. And we have 10 years to protect at least 30% of the ocean so we can restore much of this health and productivity, not just for saving biodiversity, but also saving our life support system. We are not talking about something that is apart from us. We are not apart from nature. We are a part of nature. So these 10 years are probably the most critical in the history of humanity.
The most accurate measurements of changing oceans will come from space. While Enric Sala explores what lies beneath, a new satellite is giving us data from above.
We'll learn more about our oceans and climate change, but from space. A new satellite's been launched from California. Its mission, track the accelerating rise of sea levels.
Well, the main instruments on board include a dual-frequency radar altimeter. And this is the primary instrument of the mission, and that's the one that's measuring sea surface height, significant wave height, and wind speed over the ocean. And from those measurements, we can actually have the superb measurements that we expect of sea level rise.
Data gathered from Sentinel-6 will be used alongside information from other satellites to build as complete a picture of the oceans as possible.
With a long record, we can precisely measure the acceleration. We eventually can detect new regime, tipping points. For example, if there is a runaway in the melting of Greenland or Antarctica, sea level will record this runaway change because it is an integrator of all changes that are occurring in the climate system. So we will be able to see some change, big change in the global climate.
The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration expects that sea level rise will increasingly threaten U.S. coastlines. One example, the southern tip of Manhattan is expected to flood 20 to 40 times a year by 2030.
11 of the 15 largest megacities are located at the coast, and this number will double. The number of people living in coastal area will double by 2060. So, knowing how much sea level is rising at the coast and how much it will rise in the future in coastal areas is as obvious. It's obviously a major goal for human beings.
Coming up, from sales to steam to oil, the shipping industry is no stranger to change. But how will it navigate the next transition? This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern. This is Bloomberg Green. Now, for your roundup of this week's latest climate news, Jennifer Zabazaja has your Green in Brief.
Here's the climate news you need to know. Deforestation of the world's largest rainforest has hit a 12-year high. More than 4,000 square miles of the Amazon rainforest was destroyed in 2020. That's a 9.5% increase from a year earlier. Government data shows that destruction has soared since President Jair Bolsonaro took office and weakened environmental enforcement. The Amazon is home to millions of species and plants and is critical in the fight against climate change. Bitcoin is hitting all-time highs, but at what cost to the environment? The cryptocurrency is energy intensive, and there are concerns if it becomes mainstream. According to MIT, back in 2018, Bitcoin's carbon footprint was almost as big as Portugal's. Want to get better at tackling climate change? We'll hire more women. That's according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Firms with 30% or more women in top jobs tend to perform better when it comes to the environment and are more likely to set clear climate goals. Shopping online is more popular than ever now, but the price of convenience is measured in CO2, and more deliveries means more fuel burned and more packaging wasted. So what can companies do? Well, many are becoming more efficient and sourcing more clean energy for their data centers and warehouses. And England's farmers will be paid to go green after Brexit. As European subsidies are phased out, they'll get new money to encourage them to produce healthy, sustainable food. Poor farming practices are one of the leading drivers of water pollution and the loss of biodiversity. I'm Jennifer Zabazaja in New York. Anne-Marie, back to you.
The shipping industry is more than just the grease on the wheels of globalization. It's its chief enabler. 11 billion tons of goods are transported by ship each year, the biggest contributors being 2 billion tons of oil, 1 billion tons of iron ore, and 350 million tons of grain. According to the International Chamber of Shipping, 80% of Europe's imports and exports happen over the seas. And for such a vast industry, it also contributes its fair share of emissions. Shipping makes up 12% of global transport energy consumption. So how does it clean up its act? Earlier, I caught up with Bloomberg Green reporter Laura Milan about just how big of a challenge this is going to be for the industry.
One of the main issues is size. So about 90% of the world's cargo is moved by ships. So obviously changing such a huge industry is not going to be fast and it's not going to be easy. The second issue has to do with technology. So ships obviously travel for many days at sea. It's not as easy for them to refuel as it would be for a car, for example, going on a road. And the sector still hasn't found a technology that's economically viable and that's zero emissions, and equivalent to the electric batteries for cars, for example.
But actions are being put in place to make the industry a bit more environmentally friendly. Walk us through those steps that they're taking.
That's it. So there's a first step that would involve using low emission fuels or biofuels that would significantly reduce the existing emissions. And then at regulatory level, when it comes to the policy and the governments, there are steps being made as well. I would say that the most significant ones come from the European Union, which started to track emissions a few years ago and is now looking to include shipping emissions in the emissions trading system. So that would significantly reduce and help calculate the emissions from the shipping industry. Now, China is taking similar steps. So at the moment, regions need to report shipping emissions to the central government. And finally, we have the International Maritime Organization with a pledge to reduce shipping emissions by 50% in 2050. Now, we must say that that pledge has been considered insufficient by environmental groups, but at least some steps are being taken.
So to get to 2050, the industry obviously is going to need to start tapping some new technologies. What new technologies are you seeing being introduced into the shipping industry?
So we have seen pilot technologies being developed for years now, but what's interesting about this current moment is that we're seeing big players invest in these technologies that are not yet economically viable, but that one day might be. So for example, we are seeing earlier this year, the world's largest agricultural commodities trader, Cargill, saying they will invest in attaching sails to their ships so they can make any technology that they run their ships on more efficient. Similarly, we have seen a spin-off of Airbus, the aeronautics company, developing a similar application with kites. We have been following also developments in hydrogen. So at the moment, hydrogen fuel seems like a good option, a possible option when it has been developed and when it becomes economically viable. And we have Vestas, for example, the world's largest turbine maker, developing some ships that will be able to run on hydrogen in the near future.
Coming up, rising sea levels means humans need to get creative when it comes to coastal defenses. But how do we protect both ourselves and the environment? One Israeli startup may have the answer. That's coming up next. This is Bloomberg Green. In London, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern. This is Bloomberg Green. After water, what's the resource that humans use the most? It's concrete, 3 tons a year for every person on the planet. And engineers estimate it's used twice as much as all other building materials combined. And it comes with a huge environmental cost. Concrete, not just in cities, it's a common feature on our coastlines too. And that's taking a toll on biodiversity. But one Israeli startup has found a way of making sea defenses stronger and encouraging life to thrive.
If you take a look at concrete structures like breakwaters or seawalls, the water around them is often clear. That's not actually a good thing, because it means there's no life.
Marine species are actually most abundant in coastal areas, but it's also where us humans prefer to live too. So when we build here, we drive away marine life.
The concrete in the marine world has a lot of additives, a lot of chemicals, and some of those materials are actually leaching out, and they're actually prohibiting marine life to thrive. If we keep developing without any regards to natural communities, there is a tilting point from which beyond we cannot really go back.
In the coastal city of Tel Aviv, an Israeli startup wants to revolutionize our urban coastlines. Their sea defenses are transforming lifeless man-made structures into teeming ecosystems. They do this by replacing standard concrete with their own special cement formulas.
As opposed to regular cement-based concrete, e-concrete includes certain elements that enhance the growth of marine flora and fauna of plants and animals. Our admix, which is kind of our secret sauce, is basically kind of sealing the concrete, making it less aggressive for the marine environment. That once we add it, we enable life to flourish.
In the lab, the team run tests to identify what mixes will work best for marine life.
So we take really ice cube sized concrete slabs of different compositions, and we put larvae, 20, 30, 50. We need to have a lot of replicates. We're geeky scientists, so we have to have a lot of replication and controls. And then within a few days or just a few weeks, we can get an answer on their preference. So obviously if they die, they have a very low tolerance to that specific concrete mix design. And if they thrive or they flourish, we can quantify that very quickly.
E-concrete says it typically sees double the biodiversity of regular grey concrete. From fish and sea caterpillars on their armour blocks to crabs on these tidal pools that sit on the shoreline.
This unit holds water during the low tide, so it's always moist, and therefore it has a very comfortable habitat for crabs and sea anemones and sea stars, etc. These pools have been here for less than 3 months, and this is already what you can see. It's covered with life. See the rock around it, which has been here for probably 10, 20, maybe even more years, only has a thin layer of green algae, and that's it.
As well as the composition of the cement mix, E-concrete designs its products specifically to the marine environment it will be deployed, to create niches for endangered species, or to develop nurseries like these oyster beds. The final part of the equation is creating complex surface textures to mimic natural rock or coral, an environment that helps anchor young organisms.
When concrete elements are being cast, the typical goal is to have a very slick surface, very, very smooth. The idea is to get the water to flow right across it. When we're designing e-concrete with a rough surface, we want to do the complete opposite. We want to slow the water when they are crossing the structure so that the larvae can actually adhere and attach to the surface.
E-concrete has to offer its clients more than just ecological credentials. Over time, they've discovered that creating hospitable habitats for marine life adds another advantage, one that is surely hard to ignore.
We've seen evidence to the fact that the growth of the organisms on the concrete create kind of a layer of defense. Just the addition of weight, we can actually gain stability and strength over time.
This is let's say the unit when we put it in the water. And this is after a year in the water. And what you can see here is all the oysters are completely covering it. We designed the units so they can withstand the forces and perform in terms of structural performance, but they can also be a backbone for ecological enhancement.
The company tests its miniature designs in tanks full of real seawater, rocks, plants, and animal life from around the world.
What we're looking for is the accumulation of calcium carbonate on the surface of the concrete of different mixes and different designs. This is the process that we call it biogenic buildup. So with time, we get a buildup of calcium carbonate that is sourced from marine organisms on the surface of the concrete. And we actually encapsulate the concrete with a natural rock. So when the organism die, in the case of a coral, it will die, and then another coral will sit on it, and that's how a reef is growing.
The hope that our man-made structures could become stronger over time also means better economics. The units require less maintenance and could therefore stay in the water for longer. E-concrete, though, is just a few years old, so it needs more time to really quantify the longevity of its products. But the company are certain their products are better for the environment, and not just in terms of improving biodiversity.
We're kind of trying to offset some of that immense carbon footprint of the concrete industry.
Construction is responsible for about 11% of global carbon emissions. By adding a biological crust to their products, e-concrete prevents some CO2 from being released into the atmosphere.
For every kilogram of calcium carbonate being created by those marine organisms, we're offsetting 120 grams of CO2. So think about building a port infrastructure or a city waterfront that is an active carbon sink. I think that's a great advantage of the technology.
That does it for this week, but let's keep the conversation going on Twitter. Follow us at Climate. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Bloomberg Quick Takes Tim Stenovic on Bloomberg Radio.
Stop the chit-chat, you two. We got a show to do.
Okay, Dave Wilson is in here. We're just talking about stocks that are moving.
We have such a Friday moment. When Dave goes on radio early and TV, both Tim and I are like, oh, there's a gainer, there's a decliner for our Beyond the Bell later on. So, you know, he just gets us read in kind of early.
I love it.
I love it too. Hey, it is Friday, June 25th, 2021. Carol Masser, Tim Stenovic in our Interactive Broker studio, streaming on YouTube. The recovery trade, Tim, it is on in a big way.
Yeah, stocks headed toward their best week since April. Also, we are talking vaccines and getting a vaccine for the next virus, Carol.
Sorry, everybody. A little bit of a downer.
We're like past the booster shot phase, already talking about the next one.
I know. Well, we got to start planning. Come on. We do have a little bit of a playbook now. Getting an infrastructure deal, though, done. Not so easy. The playbook on this one, I'm guessing a little bit of politics will be at play.
Also not so easy, especially on a Friday, getting back to work, at home, at the office.
I thought about calling in.
Fridays and
Mondays,
Mondays,
we do the show
I feel like
outside
a lot
today?
of people are working from home.
We were seeing that. It was an easy drive in this morning. We're also going to talk to the CEO of PF Chang's because, man, they well-known brand. They had to pivot, though, because of the pandemic.
Yeah, we've got the company's CEO. All that and more coming up in the next 3 hours. In the meantime, let's get a check on the trading day with Doug Krisner.
Hey, Tim. Hi, Carol. Mixed market right now. We do have the financials trading higher with the S&P Financials Index up about 1.2%. We know now the big banks have passed the Fed's latest stress test, and we're bracing for announcements next week on both dividends and stock buybacks. Questions remain, though, especially when it comes to things like net interest margins going forward, as well as trading revenue. Now, we do have a 10-year Treasury yielding 1.54%, so we're up about 5 basis points on the day. That could be helping things out just a bit for the financials. Dow Industrial Average right now ahead 0.7%. Nike shares up nearly 15%. The company is projecting revenue this fiscal year will surpass $50 billion for the first time. In spite of those gains, seeing a little bit of weakness among info tech stocks, and that is pulling the NASDAQ composite down from a record by about 0.1%. I'm Doug Krisner. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
Happy Friday, Doug Krisner.
Thank you.
All right, let's get to the market drivers report, everyone. And let's set that Business Week agenda. In the house, the aforementioned Dave Wilson. He is our Bloomberg Stocks columnist and editor. So, how do you see the trade today?
Aforementioned. I kind of like that word.
You're welcome.
In any case, I see it all as a warm-up act, really.
Why?
Because once you get to the close of trading, you have the annual Russell reconstitution, where they go through all the indexes, the Russell 1000 for larger companies, the Russell 2000 for smaller ones, and a whole bunch of related indexes like growth and value that you've got tens of billions of dollars of exchange-traded funds tied into.
Are we going to be surprised by a lot of the changes?
Well, I mean, it's not a surprise in the sense that it is a process that happens over time.
Okay.
So they actually use market value as of May 7th as a sort of defining point for what's a larger company and what's a smaller company in that context. And back then, AMC Entertainment was only a $4 billion company. Now it's more like $28 billion. So, that they're going to have to deal with that issue, not to mention GameStop, which had, run up quite a bit. Those two stocks alone, 2.5% of the gain in the Russell 2000 index over the last 12 months since the last time they did this.
Is it a pure market cap decision, or is there some discretion about, well, wait a minute, this has been a volatile name?
It's pretty pure. I mean, we'll see how it plays out once you get to the end of the day. Well, what it comes down to is you're going to have a whole bunch of trading tied into the changes. Companies going into one index, coming out of the other. Fund managers need to adjust, especially those with index funds or ETFs. So, look for a big burst of trading at the close, and then, before the open on Monday, the changes all go into effect.
So what does that mean for Monday's trading day when the market's open at 9:30?
And Tim doesn't care because he's on vacation.
Oh, yeah, good point. I care, though.
Did I remember that?
I care. I'll get a little alert.
I care. Yeah.
Well, I'll just give you sort of one example that you can kind of keep an eye on. And it's not the companies we talked about already. Caesars, the casino owner, second biggest decline in the S&P 500 today. And there isn't an obvious reason, aside from the fact that it's also one of the biggest companies in the Russell 2000, and it's going to be moving up. So the real question is, how does the money flow into and out of the stock, as, the smaller company fund managers sell and the bigger ones buy? Net, what does that mean?
Wait. So you're seeing the decline in Caesars today as a result of its movement because of the Russell rebalance?
All I'm suggesting is that's something you can kind of keep an eye on, beyond GameStop, beyond AMC, to sort of understand how these arguably technical changes that happen once a year in the composition of the Russell indexes, might play out in a given stock.
I'm thinking Tim is taking notes for his decliners.
Yeah, I am. Always.
I'm
not typing yet, though. I'm just thinking.
He's mulling. He's mulling.
Go ahead, Carol.
No, good week, though, for stocks. I mean, if you are a bull in this market.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a good week. And with the financials kind of leading the parade, I mean, that doesn't exactly come as a surprise given the results of the Federal Reserve stress test late yesterday. All the banks that were involved passed. So, we get to the close on Monday, and it's not going to be about the Russell. It's going to be about all the bank dividends going up and, the stock buyback programs being put in place or increased, because that's when they can do it if they indeed pass the test.
That's the first opportunity where they can actually come out and say, here's what we're going to do.
That's right.
Dave, let's just talk about the lull that we're in right now, because we are getting close to the second half of the year, kicking it off. We're going to start to hear from companies in a few weeks with the reports for their second quarter.
We certainly are, and people are going to be expecting a lot. You know, I mean, if you want to take a look at Nike as sort of a reference point, why is the stock up 15%? Well, it's not just about the most recent quarter. It's more about the outlook for the current fiscal year. I mean, they are expecting more in terms of sales than analysts were looking for.
Boom. I mean, Punim Goyal from Bloomberg Intelligence was just like off the charts.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Just pretty impressive.
So it really becomes about the outlook, as it often is. I mean, we've seen that the last few quarters, you know, where companies have beaten analysts' average earnings estimates in a Bloomberg survey more than they have in the past, and yet the shares either don't react at all or go down. And it's, you know, a matter of what does the outlook say relative to what the past quarter's numbers say. And in a lot of cases, you get a disconnect. So, you know, analysts expecting a lot, so it then becomes a matter of, can companies deliver? Can they live up to those expectations?
Right. You told me, now show me.
Exactly.
Is kind of how it goes. Great stuff. Dave, thank you so much. Dave Wilson, our aforementioned Dave Wilson, stocks editor at Bloomberg News. He will be back a little bit later on.
Let's do the Bloomberg Business Week Bite of the Day. It's one number that tells us a lot. It's brought to you by GEP. GEP helps businesses transform supply chains with strategy, managed services, and AI-based cloud-native software. Learn more at GEP.com.
Today's number is 370. Do you know what it is without cheating?
I don't.
Oh, I didn't either.
What is it?
Okay, it is the crypto boom has left industry leaders looking to fill hundreds of positions worldwide. Binance is advertising for some 370 roles globally. That's according to its LinkedIn recruitment portal. New York-based Gemini plans to boost its Singapore headcount to 50 from 30 by December. And Hong Kong's Crypto.com listing more than 200 openings with more than half based in Asia. We can ask Becky Frankowitz about that.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear, because we have, you know, look, the narrative out of Washington is that, well, there's a lot of different narratives out of Washington when it comes to filling positions. But if you listen to what Republicans are saying, they're saying, hey, it's because of these enhanced unemployment benefits. That's why not jobs are not getting filled. But on the other side of that is the idea that, well, there is no childcare right now. Schools are closed. It's summer. People are worried to go back because of variants.
I also think, you know, it's a new industry, right? Yeah. And all of a sudden, you know, anybody who knows anything about it is in demand. And so, there's just like a bunch of new companies that are coming into the field. So we're going to talk about jobs a little bit later on. And sorry to be such a bummer, but as Tim mentioned earlier, never too early to start rethinking or thinking about the next virus. We're going to talk with Dr. Kevin Tracy over at the Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. They're saying, you know, you got to think about the next vaccine.
And hopefully scientists are thinking about that. Also, we're getting an infrastructure deal. Well, are we? It is not so simple, Carol. We went into some of the details yesterday. We're going to give you day 2 analysis in just a few minutes.
Exactly. And then we're going to talk about restaurants with the CEO of P.F. Chang's.
Ooh.
I'm hungry.
Yeah.
I didn't have lunch.
You got to eat lunch. Maybe during one of the breaks. There's no lunch break.
Don't watch on YouTube because I'll be eating. All right, let's get to world and national news.
Nancy Lyons is in D.C. Hey there, Nancy.
Hey, Tim. At this hour, a Minneapolis judge will be announcing the sentence for Derek Chauvin, the former officer convicted in the death of George Floyd. Prosecutors have requested a sentence of 30 years, saying Chauvin's actions were egregious and shocked the nation's conscience, while Chauvin's defense attorney has requested probation, saying his client was the product of a broken system and believed he was just doing his job. The judge earlier today denied Chauvin's request for a new trial. Vice President Kamala Harris has been touring the U.S.-Mexico border today following months of pressure from Congress to visit the region. She's been in El Paso with Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. She says the situation at the border is tough and says more work is needed. She met today with 5 young girls who had been held at a Customs and Border Protection Processing Center after crossing the border. The number of people unaccounted for in the collapse of the Surfside, Florida beachfront high-rise is now up to 159. That number climbing overnight as search and rescue continues to look for survivors. 4 people are confirmed dead. Miami-Dade Mayor Daniela Levine Cava says rescue teams are still holding out hope to find survivors under the rubble.
We are going to work as hard as we can to continue our search and rescue effort. That is our priority. That is where we're focused, and protecting our first responders who are on the scene.
Cava says crews have heard some tapping and other noises, but rescuers really don't know whether those sounds are human-made or just being caused by the settling of the rubble. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
All right, Nance, thank you so much. Carol Masser, Tim Stanovic in our Interactive Broker studio. This story caught my attention. Dow Jones, Wall Street Journal. It's looking at sports and COVID-19, and it says, and I'm just reading from the story, a star NBA player, the U.S. Open golf champion, and a Ugandan Olympic coach have something in common that is creating a new headache for sports organizers. They tested positive for the novel coronavirus, after being vaccinated.
Yeah, Luis Rednadovsky and Rachel Bachman write for Dow Jones that throughout the pandemic, athletes have been the most tested population on the planet, sometimes providing vivid examples of emerging theories and sometimes helping prove them. These athletes are showing that while vaccines are exceptionally effective in preventing death and severe illness from the coronavirus and its known variants, some are far from foolproof in preventing infection altogether.
Which is why we've had guests on when it comes to the virus saying testing is an important part of this process. Even as more people get vaccinated, we all get tested every week, and it's this just check on, okay, we know you're vaccinated, but just in case.
Well, there is concern that among some medical professionals who I've spoken to, that if you've been vaccinated with one of these highly effective vaccines, you don't necessarily need to be tested regularly if you're not showing symptoms, because if you do show signs of a breakthrough infection, you wouldn't be able to do certain things. And those things that you won't be able to do include going to work, and you know, being around people, even though you can't necessarily, you're not symptomatic and you don't necessarily, will not necessarily pass it along to someone else.
So you shouldn't be tested?
Well, it's kind of unclear at this point. I know. Well, this is something we're going to ask the doctor about because there's differing views on this.
Well, and this story from Dow Jones says, you know, these surprising positive tests are a problem for the hosts of large events, and we're thinking about the Olympics. In the case of the Olympics, as Wall Street Journal reports, they could trigger an outbreak in the surrounding Japanese population or beyond to any of the 200 participating nations, in addition to creating chaos in competitions. This is just a reminder that there's still so much we don't know, right? We've learned a lot. We have a playbook, but we still don't know everything.
What we do know, though, is the vaccines work. If you can be vaccinated, you should get the vaccine. That's what the CDC tells us.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Tape. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
The equity market is trading mixed. We have financials leading the S&P 500 higher by about 0.3%, extending a record at 4278. But weakness among tech shares sending the NASDAQ comp down about 0.1%. This is down from a record high, by the way, at 14,362. We know when it comes to the financials that the big banks have passed the Fed's latest stress test. We're bracing for announcement next week on dividends and stock buybacks. The S&P Financials Index right now higher by about 1.2%. Earlier, Boston Fed Bank President Eric Rosengren was talking about potential risk in housing prices. He says it's the wrong time in the cycle to have housing booms that actually go bust. Rosengren says the risk should be taken into account as the Fed sets monetary policy going forward. We've got a 10-year Treasury right now yielding 1.53%. And shares in Virgin Galactic Holdings, they are up by more than 31% right now. The company has been cleared by the FAA to fly customers into space. I'm Doug Krisner. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Doug, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So among our COVID headlines, we have India talking about some of the cases of the Delta plus COVID-19 variant. They're finding that across 11 states. Authorities saying it's too early to tell whether it poses a significant threat. Meantime, New Jersey had 0 in-hospital coronavirus deaths yesterday, for the first time since July.
Let's get right into it with Dr. Kevin Tracy, President and CEO of the Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. He's joining us on the phone from Greenwich, Connecticut. Dr. Tracy, really great to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Very well. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. How do you feel about where we are, not as the United States, but as the world when it comes to this pandemic? Because there are two starkly different stories playing out right now.
There are. I think there's a story of the countries that are vaccinated or moving towards vaccination, and the countries that are at small numbers of vaccination, and those are two different stories.
Well, to that point, go ahead.
The story of the vaccination, as you implied, is an incredible success. In fact, in my view, in the history of medicine, this will go down as a milestone up there with the cholera pump, creating epidemiology, and the invention of vaccines and the germ theory of disease by Lister and Pasteur. I think history will look back at the fact that a pandemic occurred, and within a year the virus was identified, a vaccine was made, and within a year and a half, millions of people were vaccinated and protected. And the success of the vaccine continues because once people have been vaccinated, they're not going to the hospital. The people who are in the hospital now, and it's a very small number in the United States, thankfully, but the people in the hospital now, overwhelmingly, were not vaccinated.
But the issue is and remains to be, and I wonder for how long it will be. I mean, I was talking to a colleague of mine from another country whose family is in another country, and they have no access to vaccine. They were supposed to get J&J vaccine. That was spoiled. AstraZeneca was supposed to get there, but nobody wants to take it because they're concerned about blood clots. So how does this play out outside of the United States, outside of the UK?
I think that's an incredibly important question. I don't have a great answer for you. I mean, you have countries that invested heavily and bet on vaccines that were not yet invented or made, and now those vaccines are being produced and distributed. You have countries who didn't have the resources to do that, and now they are waiting and hoping that something will happen. And then you have countries that invested in vaccines, and problems happen with manufacturing. You know, it's sometimes hard to remember that this virus still hasn't had its second birthday. And when you move into research and development, you know, one of my favorite definitions of research is by Albert Einstein, who said famously, if we knew what it was we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, would it? So when you put into context the fact that you're facing a great unknown, and you have issues not only of inventing the vaccine and manufacturing it for the first time, but then assuring it's safe for millions, if not hundreds of millions of people, and then the logistics of giving it out to countries rich and poor, it's going to be a huge lift for another year or two at least.
Yeah, it feels that way. So if it is a huge lift for another year or two, as we've all reminded everyone that it is a global pandemic and not until it's under control globally are we really out of it. So what's the scenario over the next 12 to 24 months?
Well, I think the human race is famous for collaborating to solve problems, and I think we did also see a lot of that as a good news story in the last 18 months. And I think we're going to see renewed collaboration by many countries to solve the countries that are really suffering now. And I think you're seeing that. I think the United States is stepping up and providing vaccines where it can, and other countries are doing the same thing. I think you're going to see collaboration to help the countries that can't help themselves as well. I also think you're going to see significant continued investments in science in the United States, which are absolutely critical, and in Europe and in other countries. And these investments are critical because even if you were to vaccinate everybody immediately, the virus is still going to be around for a while. And we're going to need to invest in therapies that treat the virus for people who either haven't been vaccinated or for those small number of cases that do get infected after they've been vaccinated. And President Biden has proposed and seems to have significant support for this across both parties to spend more money on science. And I think that's crucial as a national security effort for the United States.
So what is the United... Go ahead, Carol.
Well, I was just thinking about the story that we talked about, the athletes.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too.
You know, vaccinated athletes are testing positive for the coronavirus. How are we supposed to, when we hear a headline like that, as people, for many of us who've been vaccinated, like, should we still be worried? Should we be concerned? I don't know. How do you interpret that?
Well, I can't. I interpret it from my. I can't reassure everyone how they should feel about this. This is new for everybody. But I can tell you how I feel about it, which is what you asked me. And how I feel is that, look, I'm a scientist and I look at the numbers. And when you look at the people in the hospital today with COVID, they weren't vaccinated. It's the vaccine. What does that mean? That means the vaccine that you got in your arm will keep you out of the hospital. Now, if you get COVID and don't go to the hospital, okay, you got COVID. Mm-hmm. But what you worry about with COVID is having a cytokine storm and going in the ICU in the hospital. The vaccine is preventing that. So I'm quite optimistic that everybody should be vaccinated because the vaccine keeps people out of the hospital. And that's really what you worry about. I think that the story of the athletes getting it, I think the New York Yankees, a bunch of them tested positive a couple of weeks ago. You know, that's going to be the story for some time. And so I think the discussion has to be that we need to continue to invest heavily in research and heavily in science because that will provide answers like Tamiflu and maybe some other pills that people can take when they get COVID and keep them out of the hospital. Maybe even people who haven't been vaccinated will have medicines available.
We want to talk more about that, and we definitely see commercial real estate investment going into kind of labs and
life sciences.
Right, life sciences. So we certainly see that in play. We're going to come back to Dr. Kevin Tracy, President and CEO at Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. We'll get back to that in just a moment, right here on Bloomberg.
Broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studio in New York. Bloomberg 1130 to Washington, D.C. Bloomberg 99.1 to Boston. Bloomberg 106.1 to San Francisco. Bloomberg 960 to the country. Sirius XM Channel 119. And around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
We're going to get back to Dr. Kevin Tracy, President and CEO of Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. This is the research arm of Northwell Health, the massive system here in the New York metro area. But talk about really the next vaccine. We need to be working on it.
Yeah, treatments as well. Really curious to hear about how we prevent the next pandemic, or at least prevent the severity of it from being as bad as what happened.
And be more prepared so that it can get out, those treatments, to more people globally. All right, we'll get back to him in just a second. Let's get back, though, to Doug Krisner with a check on that trading day. Hey, Doug.
Hey, Carol. Kind of a mixed picture right now. We do have the Dow higher by 0.7%. The advance is being led by Nike, which is up just about 15% right now. After the bell yesterday, the company offered a projection on revenue for this fiscal year that will be above $50 billion for the first time ever. In the broader market, we have the S&P extending a record high by about 0.3%, although information tech weakness right now sending the NASDAQ composite lower, off from a record high as well by about 0.1%. The Russell 2000 with a gain of 0.4%. So the small caps holding up as well. Also moving higher, long-term interest rates. A 10-year Treasury now picking up just about 5 basis points in yield. We are at 1.53, and crude oil right now above $74 a barrel. This is WTI in the extended session right now. The gain is something greater than 1%. I'm Doug Krisner. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Doug Krisner, thank you so much. I want to get right back to our guest. Still with us, Dr. Kevin Tracy, President and CEO at Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. It's the research arm of Northwell Health, which is the largest healthcare provider and private employer in New York State. They have been with the virus and vaccine really from day one. He is also a professor of molecular medicine and neurosurgery. He joins us from Greenwich, Connecticut. That's where we still find him. So, Dr. Tracy, what do we need to see healthcare institutions, the government, R&D efforts? What do we need to see happening right now so that we are planning and getting ready for the next virus that impacts society?
We need to plan and get ready for the next virus.
Well said.
It will come. This one was predicted by many and ignored by most, and that mistake should not be repeated. And the solution really comes from investment into research and development of, as you said in the introduction, into continued vaccine development, but also to continue to invest in drugs to treat the disease that are separate from the vaccine. So what most people don't realize about research is that the work goes on for decades before it can be moved into usefulness, and the movement. And so the research identifies the targets and develops the drugs, and that can go on for decades. And then it has to be developed, and the development can take years and years and years. So people, get used to their iPhones, and they get used to their Androids, and they get used to their watches and their Fitbits. These things are engineering. They're not medicine. They're not biology. They're not alive. The living systems that are required to make drugs and vaccines can't be quickly engineered. It takes time and work, and the way to prepare for the future is to invest in that work now.
Is it something that the government needs to be involved in?
Absolutely, because the profit doesn't come for decades. So the government historically and the governments historically across the world are the main funders for the science that goes on to look up the alley to see if it's blind. Discoveries come with no profit. Discoveries come from hard work and heavy investment. But once the discoveries are made, as in the case of the new vaccines for COVID, the mRNA vaccines, these things were being worked on by people sort of quietly 25 years ago, when most of their peers of these scientists were famously telling them they were going to fail, that it couldn't be possible. 25 years ago. Think about that. Think what you were doing 25 years ago. Well, somebody was making investments in these individuals in the hope that maybe they were right, and thank goodness they did.
It is difficult, though, for publicly held companies, right, when they are thinking about their R&D efforts, that there can be a lot of moonshots, or they throw things out there that never come to be. So how do we guarantee, how much does government have to backstop all of this in order for it to happen? Because we've had lots of conversations here at Bloomberg about, we know what the next handful of lethal viral problems that are out there. We've got the vaccine hunters or virus hunters that are out there finding them. So we kind of know what we need to go after. So how do we make sure it gets done? Again, does it have to be from the government?
The research has to be from the government.
Okay.
It's a simple fact that as of today, I looked recently, there's something like 8,000 drugs being developed by the pharmaceutical industry and the biotechnology companies as we speak. 8,000 drugs. More than 95% of them were invented in laboratories like mine and my colleagues, not-for-profit laboratories. And those laboratories and those universities and those medical schools are funded by the government. So the inventing work and the research that underlies the drugs you take for granted today came out of not-for-profit laboratories. That is the system that works. That's the system that's been in place for decades. And that's the system in not just the United States, but in the countries that invent new drugs, including China, including the UK, including most of the EU, including Israel and the United States and Japan. That's how it works.
Well, it's interesting. We talk about industrial races, or we call about, kind of the new tech war that's going on globally, especially between between China and the rest of the world. Do you see a war, kind of a race here to get the next best, when it comes to virus treatments, vaccine treatments? Are we going to see a little bit of a war because of that?
I don't think we're going to see a war because of that. I think that scientists are actually more collaborative than competitive. They compete with themselves more than with each other. They're competing with themselves to make the best discovery that will be the most useful to the most people. Companies compete to develop things faster. Development, I'm not minimizing development. Development is extraordinarily expensive. That's the process of taking the molecules from the laboratory, testing them in human beings, looking to see if they work, manufacturing them and selling them. So that can take years. So the research process in the laboratory is very competitive in the sense that people want to do the best that they can do. The financial competition comes at the other end when you move into development and sales. And I think in the case of this vaccine, I think you had countries placing huge orders on vaccines that hadn't been invented yet.
Right.
And I think that sort of answers your question.
Hey, Dr. Tracy, just in the last 30 seconds that we have, 20 seconds, what about when it comes to things other than vaccines for the next pandemic? I'm thinking PPE and the way that we weren't prepared with ventilators, PPE, and more. 20 seconds.
Well, I think there was a call to action that we need to be better prepared, not just for vaccines, but for new therapies that will treat the virus in patients who haven't been vaccinated. And we have to be better prepared with the infrastructure, including things like PPE and ventilators. There were stockpiles. There were stockpiles created after SARS-1, and they were depleted by hurricanes and other things. We need to revisit how we maintain our stockpiles.
All right, good stuff. Thank you so much. And really just a very thoughtful and truthful conversation about what we need to be planning for. That's Dr. Kevin Tracy, President and CEO of Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research.
Let's get a check of world and national news with Nancy Lyons in D.C. Hey, Nance.
Well, in a case that sparked protests all across the country this afternoon, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is learning his sentence for murder in George Floyd's death. Prosecutors have requested 30 years. Defense attorneys want probation. The court is now listening to videotape testimony of his 7-year-old daughter, Gianna.
If you could say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
It would be, I miss you and I love you.
Gianna Floyd's testimony is one of 4 victims' impact statements being read. Earlier today, the judge rejected Chauvin's request for a new trial. We will be going live to the courtroom for the sentencing, which should be happening in just a few minutes. The Justice Department is taking Georgia to court over its new voting law. Attorney General Merrick Garland says the move fulfills a promise to protect voting rights, which he says is the key pillar of democracy.
Our complaint alleges that recent changes to Georgia's election laws were enacted with the purpose of denying or abridging the right of black Georgians to vote on account of their race or color in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Garland says the Georgia lawsuit is the first step to ensure that all eligible voters can cast a vote and that their vote will count. Authorities in Spain say everything points to suicide in the death of security software tycoon John McAfee while in his jail cell. But his wife today demanded a thorough investigation of his death, saying her husband did not appear suicidal when they last spoke. McAfee was found dead just hours after a Spanish court approved his extradition to the U.S. on tax evasion charges. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
All right, Nancy, thank you so much. You are listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Massar along with Tim Stanovic, and we are monitoring in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We are getting ready to hear the sentencing of Derek Chauvin. Of course, he is facing decades in prison for murder of George Floyd, and likely, or at least according to some analysis, that he could get 15 to 25. Right now, what's happening is Judge Peter Cahill is hearing impact statements from George Floyd's family. 3 of 4 have already been heard, so we are obviously monitoring it, and we'll take you there live as soon as the sentencing happens. In the meantime, we want to bring in our own June Grosso. She's Bloomberg News legal analyst, host of Bloomberg Law on the Access Line from New York City. June, what will you be watching in this sentencing?
Well, I think the real question is going to be whether and how much Judge Peter Cahill does what's called an upwards departure. Because in a normal case in Minnesota, guidelines recommend about 12 and a half years in prison for each murder charge and 4 years for the manslaughter charges. However, what happened here is the judge found, after the prosecution requested, several aggravating factors in the case, and that was that Chauvin treated Floyd with particular cruelty, that he abused his position of trust and authority, and that he committed this murder in front of children. So the judge can use those to make a departure upward on the sentence. And it seems likely to me that Judge Cahill will make a departure upwards, so it will be more than 12 and a half years. The question is how much more. The prosecutors are asking for 30 years in prison. So will the judge go that high or not? That's the real question here. And I have to remember one thing. These statements by witnesses are so heartfelt, and they really tug at your heartstrings. But the judge, in all likelihood, has already made his decision about what sentence he's going to give. He's read the briefs on either side. He's read the pre-sentencing report. So he knows what he's going to do.
What have we heard, June, from the defense thus far, and what are they looking for?
Well, the defense is looking for, probation, which is not going to happen. And the defense has been trying to get a new trial. And every motion they've made before the judge has been denied. They've even asked for a hearing into possible juror misconduct because they had accused a juror of not being candid during jury selection because he didn't mention his participation in a march last summer to honor Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. So everything that the defense has asked so far, they have been turned down. And you know that they're going to use the same arguments that they're using for a new trial in order to file for an appeal in the case. And you have to remember something else, because everyone's asking, will Derek Chauvin say something? Because the judge will give him the opportunity to make a statement. He hasn't expressed remorse. There was no remorse expressed in the sentencing papers the defense submitted. And you have to remember that anything he says could be used against him in the federal civil rights trial that he is going to be facing that hasn't been scheduled yet. So if he does say something, he has to be very careful about what he says.
June, how much of this is kind of a straightforward case in terms of the sentencing because of that video? We've all seen it so many times of Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes. That video seemed to me to be critical.
It is critical. It was critical, and it was really the ultimate reason for the jury's decision in this case, and it will be critical in the judge's sentencing. And you heard that in the aggravating factors he's accepted, one being that Floyd acted with particular cruelty. That's from seeing that video over and over again. And that he abused his position of trust as a police officer. That also is from that video. So this is not going to be a sentencing as it would be in a case where the same thing happened, but there wasn't national attention to it. This has become, I mean, George Floyd is now, an icon for racial justice in this country. So this sentence is going to represent a lot more than what happened in this instance, I think. I think it's going to, be very heavy because of all the implications of this sentence. People will be looking at this and saying, why didn't he get more time? Why wasn't he punished more? Some people are saying, why can't he spend the rest of his life in prison? That's what a verdict, a sentence should be. So it's going to play heavily in this. And you've got to imagine that the judge is weighing what he thinks he should give against the reaction that any sentence he gives is going to have in, the national headlines, in the public reaction.
We are talking with June Grosso, Bloomberg News legal analyst, host of Bloomberg Law, with us on the Access line from New York City. We are at the same time monitoring members of George Floyd's family, his community. They have been making impact statements before Judge Peter Cahill in that Minneapolis courtroom. There are 4 statements being made, and the last one is being heard by the judge. We're, of course, waiting for that sentencing that June has been talking about and laying out, and then we are expected to obviously hear more from members of the family. June, in the meantime, is it odd that Chauvin's lawyers argued he should receive probation because he has no criminal history, or is that the law at work? That's what they do?
That's what they do. That's what they do. Because you ask for usually the defense will ask for the lowest possible sentence that is, imaginable in the whole scheme of sentencing. And then the prosecution often will ask for, the heaviest possible sentence. And, you have to remember that whatever sentence he gets, he is now in a maximum security prison. He is being confined to a cell by himself for his own protection. His meals are being brought to him. So whatever sentence he gets is going to be hard prison time for him. It's going to be very difficult because he's a police officer and because he's now a symbol of, a miscarriage of justice. So it's going to be very hard time, and the defense is going to try to, make the judge come down a little bit in what he's going to give, but there's no doubt that it's going to be more than 12 and a half years because of the aggravating factors that have been found and because of what we were discussing before. And what you saw here with the witness statements, I mean, there was just there was a video of his daughter, and they were asking her about seeing her father, what she would say. I mean, it's heartbreaking, but as I said before, the judge has made his decision already, I'm sure.
June, you referenced a civil rights trial that will take place. That whatever the ruling today, this is not the end of the matter. Talk a little bit about that and what consequences Chauvin could actually face in another trial.
Well, it's, I have to say that of all the people I've talked to, the civil rights trial is a bit odd here because usually in every case I can think of, the only time prosecutors file federal civil rights charges is when the case below fell apart, when the defendant wasn't convicted below. So you remember in the Rodney King case where the officers weren't found guilty in the state case, then the federal charges were filed. So it's odd here that they're filing federal charges that are basically going to be a replay of what happened in the state court. And yes, they could add time on it. It seems more likely to me that the sentence might be concurrent there. But it is piling on. And I think this goes back to the fact that this case is sort of a test of the legal system in a lot of people's eyes and whether there's going to be justice. So the feds came in and decided that they were going to try him too. Very unusual.
What about when it comes to the other police officers who have been charged with aiding and abetting murder? Their trial is set to start in March. What can we expect from that?
Well, I think
what you'll see is, well, first of all, it will not be the same intensity level that you had in Derek Chauvin's trial, because they were the officers standing by. And there you're going to see the same evidence. You're going to see the same kind of same people testifying, basically. You're going to see that video over and over again. And they're going to have to put forth, some of them are going to say they were just following, he was the senior officer, they were just following what he was saying. Others are going to say, one of them is going to say that he tried to get him to stop and he tried to get medical attention. So there are going to be different variations of, I wasn't responsible for what happened there. It wasn't my fault what happened, and putting all the responsibility on Chauvin, which is the reason why the case was severed. What is called severance, where the judge says of a certain number of defendants, okay, you defendants are going to be tried separately from this defendant, because the case would have been unfair to the other officers to have them tried with Chauvin. So the judge made that decision here. But it's going to be a lot of the same thing. And the difference is going to be how they're going to express their sort of distance from what happened, even though they're standing right there. And you'll see them in the video. So it's going to be another tough case, I would think.
What struck you about this whole case and process, June?
It's difficult. I guess it was sort of amazing to me that the expert testimony on the defense side was not better. Mm-hmm. It just was amazing to me that they didn't have people that really, because normally in any case, as you know, Carol, it's the battle of the expert witnesses. Right. And you have one expert witness who says it's night, and the other expert witness says, no, it's day. And then some in between who say, well, it was sort of mid-morning or something, But here you really didn't have a great defense expert witness countering what the prosecution said. And there was some room there because there were several, there were a couple of medical examiner's reports, and the medical examiner had notes that changed what he said, basically. But they didn't really hit on that. They didn't play that very well. That was the most surprising to me. And, the most troubling, of course, was the statements of all the people who watched this and how it affected them. A young girl saying that, she thinks about this every night and it's terrorized her. So, and of course the video, that was seeing that video over and over again. That was the centerpiece of the trial.
Exactly. We're talking with June Grosso, our Bloomberg News legal analyst, host of Bloomberg Law. And of course, we are awaiting the sentencing of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. He will be sentenced. We are watching it, the live proceedings underway in a Minneapolis courtroom. We have seen one of the prosecutors in the case, Matthew Frank, making some statements and thanking his family and the witnesses for their help. Prior to that, we heard 4 impact statements from members of George Floyd's family talking about the impact that all of this, and of course the death of their family member, has had on their lives. June, of course, talking about the sentencing. Let's remind everybody that prosecutors are looking for a 30-year prison term for Chauvin. He was found guilty of all charges: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter. But as soon as we do hear the sentencing, we will take you there.
June, as Carol mentioned, we're hearing right now from Matthew Frank, the Minnesota Assistant Attorney General. We heard from 4 members of Floyd's Circle who spoke for talking about impact statements. Take us through what to expect on a day such as today. Who else do we hear from?
Well, you'll hear from the defense attorney. I expect that there's only going to be one prosecutor talking in this case, making the argument for tough sentencing. But I know that the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, is in the courtroom. I don't know whether he will talk or not. But so you'll have this, the prosecutor speaking, then you'll have the defense attorney speaking, and then the judge will turn to Derek Chauvin and ask whether he wants to say anything. And in many cases, the defendant will use that opportunity to say, I'm sorry for what I did. He could say, but as I said before, he has to think about whatever he says has to be thought about in light of the appeal he's going to make, as well as the federal civil rights trial that he's going to face. So he doesn't want to say anything that's going to incriminate him in that way. But he certainly could could express some remorse for what happened. He could phrase that in a way to express remorse without expressing the guilt of murder, that he committed murder. So, sorry for what happened, blah, blah, that kind of thing. But what leads me to think that perhaps he's not going to speak is because in the sentencing papers that the defense filed, there was no mention of remorse. So that leads me to think that perhaps he won't talk. And remember, he didn't take the stand. And people afterwards said, why didn't he take the stand? And he didn't take the stand because if he had said anything, you would have had the prosecution taking each and everything he said and showing him the video and saying, what do you mean you didn't exert pressure here? Look at this. What about that? It would have been just impossible.
It does make you realize, June, right? And we talked about this earlier, that if we did not have that 9 minutes of video, it could have been a very different process. It would have been a very different process.
It would have been totally different.
Yeah.
If you think of, this is an unusual case where you have a conviction for murder of a police officer. If you think in recent years of the acquittals of officers in the deaths of Philando Castile in Minneapolis and Terrence Crutcher in Oklahoma and 2 mistrials over Samuel Dubois in Ohio. I mean, we could go on and on. The Eric Garner case in New York. I mean, there are countless cases where police officers are not held accountable. And that, I really think that might have happened in this case. If you consider the circumstances, what happened, it was the police were called to the scene by someone, he wouldn't get in the car. I think it would have been a totally different case if you didn't have that video.
Well,
I think you're right.
Well, thinking about this from an analysis perspective and from this moving forward, does the idea of as law enforcement says, a police-involved shooting or the killing of somebody by a police officer, it's been a huge issue in our country. It's been a terrible issue in our country. But does it change after this from a legal perspective?
I don't think from a legal perspective it changes, except that perhaps you have prosecutors who feel more pushed, more pressure to charge police officers and to charge them, with heavier charges than they might have before. That might be one, but as far as what happens in the courtroom, I don't think that changes at all.
Yeah, hang on, June. I want to take everybody to the courtroom right now. We are hearing from one of the prosecutors, Matthew Frank, continue to make some statements. He said this case wasn't about all police officers. This case was about Derek Chauvin, disregarding all that training he received. He pointed to the abuse of trust as a reason to impose more than the sentencing guidelines in the case because Chauvin was a police officer. He's repeating, this is, again, Matthew Frank, one of the prosecutors, repeating many of the arguments that were made successfully to the judge, Peter Cahill, who has ruled, as June mentioned earlier, that Chauvin will be eligible for a harsher sentence. Frank saying, and this is a direct quote, "We give police authority to arrest, to detain, and with great power, of course, comes great responsibility." But again, June, the prosecutor's laying it out, but you said Judge Cahill in many ways has already made his decision, already laid it out. He has been sending cues all along.
He's been sending cues, and I think most judges, this is a broad statement, but I'll go out on a limb here. I think most judges know the sentence they're going to give before they actually come out and announce it. Because I've talked to judges about this, and they get so much beforehand. They get the sentencing report. They might get letters, and I'm sure they did in this case, get letters from the victims or from people involved in the case or family members. They know what's going to be said about that, and they know the arguments that they already get the arguments from the prosecution and the defense. So they have everything before them. So unless something that someone says so moves them that they would change what they already have decided, they know what they're going to sentence the person to. And as well, you'll see sometimes they read from their paper, so you know that they have decided and written up what they're going to say. And this judge, knowing that the cameras are on him, knowing that everyone is going to be talking about what he says, I'm sure he has considered also what he said, and I doubt that he's going to change what's in his mind as far as the sentence.
June, we heard Carol mention that the ex-Minneapolis police officer could get up to 40 years in prison, likelier to get between 15 to 25 years. You spoke briefly about what Chauvin has faced in prison thus far. Talk a little bit more about that and what that could look like.
Well, he is being held in a maximum security prison, which by itself is a tough prison to be in, but because he's a police officer, they can't mix him with the general population, Gen Pop, as they say in the prison movies. But they can't mix him with that, because imagine what he would face from other prisoners. He is here as he is the symbol of police injustice, of murdering an innocent person. So he can't be mixed with the general population. So they're actually he's in his cell. I don't know how many, how long he has. Sometimes it's an hour a day where they get to go outside and do some exercise. But he's in his cell all day, and his food is being brought to him. So it's a terrible kind of life. And so it's a terrible sentence. But I don't see how they're going to change that for all the years that he's in prison, because this is not going to go away. This issue is not going to go away, and the name George Floyd is going to remain in people's minds and in the history books, and perhaps in a new law. So it's going to be very hard for him. Now, I do have to say that in Minneapolis, you get 2/3 off of your sentence if you have good behavior in prison, and I doubt that he would have bad behavior. And then the final third of your sentence is on supervised release. So whatever he gets, likely he'll spend 2/3 of that in prison.
Right, and as you said, though, this has become an unfortunate benchmark, though, in terms of how society looks at police and how they handle individuals that come under their care or their surveillance. We've been talking with June Grasso, Bloomberg News legal analyst and host of Bloomberg Law. We are awaiting the sentencing of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. As soon as it happens there in that Minneapolis courtroom, we will take you there live. This is Bloomberg. All right, let's get another check on what's going on in the financial markets and your top business stories, because we've got a little bit of a rally underway. Hey, Doug.
Hey, Carol. Yeah, we do have higher stocks, especially where the Dow is concerned. Nike leading this advance. The industrial average right now is higher by 0.7%. If you look at Nike shares, higher by 15%. This is after the company projected revenue this fiscal year will surpass $50 billion for the first time. Financials trading higher. Yes, the big banks are now able to redistribute some of their capital to shareholders, either through dividends or stock buybacks. The formal announcements will be made next week. Today, the outlook on inflation, well, it remains a little murky. One measure, that is the personal consumption expenditures index, it was up 0.4% in the month of May. Compare it to last year at this time, higher by 3.9%. The Fed uses this measure for its inflation target. Now, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers is predicting higher inflation.
My guess is that at the end of the year, inflation will, for this year, come out pretty close to 5%. And it would surprise me if we had 5% inflation with no effect on inflation expectations.
Now, from the Fed's perspective, Boston Fed Bank President Eric Rosengren was saying today there's a lot of hype around inflation right now, and he is arguing these recent price spikes will subside. 10-year Treasury, nonetheless, is up in yield by about 4 basis points, 152. Dow Industrial Average ahead 0.7%. The S&P 500 higher by 0.4%, and the Nasdaq Comp up just 0.1%. I'm Doug Krisner. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Doug Krisner, thank you so much. So we are, of course, awaiting that sentencing former Minneapolis policeman Derek Chauvin, and as soon as that sentencing begins, we will take you there. Right now, we're just hearing from one of the prosecutors in that case. In the meantime, watching that, we've been talking a lot about infrastructure, rightfully so, after President Biden getting a little bit of a win there yesterday with the hard infrastructure component of the massive spending that he's looking to do in this country, Tim.
Well, joining us now is Jonathan Bernstein, politics columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, joining us now on the phone from San Antonio. Jonathan, great to have you on the show. Reading your Bloomberg Opinion column from early this morning, I'm glad you're not the only one who thinks that this is a very weird process, though you write that it's produced a a pretty clever solution. Take us into the process and why it's so nuanced.
Well, the problem is that there's so many different goals that different people have, so that, with the Democrats having a very narrow majority in both houses, what they need to keep everybody on board, and there are, people, AOC and other Democrats, Elizabeth Warren, who want to spend huge amounts of money, and then there's people like Joe Manchin of West Virginia who care not so much about how much is spent, and they want to spend money too, but they care about getting bipartisanship done because Joe Manchin comes from a very Republican state, and he wants to be able to say, aha, I was able to make a difference with a bipartisan bill. So what they wound up doing is this seemingly convoluted double-tracked situation, which is a pretty good, clever solution to the problem, I think.
Well, and I do wonder, what's going on both sides of the aisle because, midterms are just around the bend. And wouldn't it be nice, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, to go home and say, look what I got for our state?
Exactly. And, one of the things that's really a huge change in politics now versus, say, 40 or 50 years ago, it used to be that the out party would be very pleased to say, look, we got this project, that project, and the other project, and they could run on that. Because we have so much partisan polarization these days, it turns out that it's hard to sell that to your district, and Republicans in particular have sort of stopped trying. All they want to run on is partisanship. So for a lot of Republicans, they'd rather bash Joe Biden and call him, a socialist or whatever it is, than get concrete gains for their districts they can brag about.
To that end, though, does it seem like, a few months into the Biden presidency, ahead of midterm elections, he's actually making good on at least some of what he campaigned on, despite Republican resistance?
Yeah, we have a long way to go on infrastructure still, but it certainly seems to be moving towards some sort of solution that's going to at least get some of what he asked for. And of course, he had the huge relief bill right at the beginning. He's doing some other things. So yeah, I think that overall Biden's off to a reasonably good start legislatively. Again, given that it's a 50 Democrat Senate, 50 just barely majority in the House. So getting this stuff passed is not easy.
Well, and it's interesting. Do you feel like, Jonathan, as you see this, observe it, hear the conversations that come out, that there's something to President Biden saying, hey, I spent a long time in those halls, those hallowed halls of Congress. I kind of get how this works.
I think it helps. I think the other thing that helps, we do a lot of bashing of the Democratic leadership in both the chambers for being very old, but they're both old and they're experienced. And, Nancy Pelosi knows what she's doing. Chuck Schumer seems to he's newer at the job, but I think, fairly good results so far. And particularly, having Pelosi figure this stuff out and keep her caucus on board together is really a huge advantage. So less maybe Biden than what's going on the Hill. Although I think it also helps that Biden has he's experienced and he has a very experienced, solid team working on legislation.
Jonathan, I do think about our audience, the Bloomberg audience, because we've already seen financial markets kind of playing on the optimism, finally, that we could get something done when it comes to infrastructure. We've talked about it for so many years. The private sector is salivating because they have tons of funds ready to put to work. How should our audience see it, though, about what likely happens from here? Because I've heard this morning on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg TV that, hey, folks, we still have a bunch of steps to go before this gets done.
There absolutely are. In particular, the deal bill, the bipartisan bill, still needs to find 5 more Republicans, even if it holds the 5 Republicans who signed off on the deal. There's no guarantee that's going to happen. However, if it doesn't happen, there's a pretty good chance that Manchin and Sinema from Arizona are satisfied at having sort of made the motions of bipartisanship and probably will sign off on some sort of deal. But that still means they have to, even if they get the bipartisan deal, they still have to negotiate the other deal where, Democrats have different preferences. And, Joe Manchin has very different preferences of how much to spend and what to spend it on than does Bernie Sanders. I think there's a pretty good chance that'll all come together for what they're calling the reconciliation bill, the bill that will only need the 50 Democrats to agree. But there's no guarantee that's going to happen.
So what does this all mean for the human infrastructure portion of this, what the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party is looking for?
Yeah, and I wouldn't limit it to the more progressive wing. I think there's a lot of Democrats who want that kind of spending. We've got the permission. They've got the permission from Biden and Sinema to go ahead and start negotiating it. That's a big deal. They're okay with doing that portion of it through reconciliation. So the next step is actually negotiating. They haven't started yet. So, we don't really know what the roadblocks will be and what the arguments will be in a situation where any one of 50 senators can bring it to a halt and any half dozen of 220, whatever it is, members of the House can bring it to a halt.
Jonathan, I keep thinking about, bipartisanship and, both sides of the aisle actually coming together on something. And I do think about the American public who got so sick and tired of the two sides just going to their corners and not talking with one another. Is that also kind of on members of Congress, their radar as they move through this process?
I think, for somebody like Joe Manchin, for somebody like Susan Collins, a Maine Republican from Maine, it's very much on their radar. Whether it makes a difference down the road in the elections for most members, I think it doesn't, and I don't think they care that much about it. So, I think Biden certainly promised to have an open ear to try to work with everybody, and so he's, fulfilling that promise by at least trying to do a bipartisan bill. But I think, most people think now for elections, what really matters are the ultimate results, not just from what bill they pass, but how it affects the overall economy going forward.
Is that something that infrastructure is something that takes a long time to actually see the effects of it? And I think that's why it's been difficult for a lot of politicians, especially local politicians, to really push, because this is the type of thing that a large tunnel that gets built, right, is not something that you see during your tenure as governor somewhere. It's something that happens significantly after the fact. Is it something that voters will start to see the results of?
I think, especially on some of the, like you said, the soft infrastructure, those are some, payments for something like childcare could happen much quicker. But even so, traditionally, politicians love to have, a press conference when the bill passes, a press conference when the money is appropriated, a press conference and an event when they cut the ribbon on beginning the construction, and then, over and over again. So, yes, it doesn't sort of start producing the economic results right away, but it can start producing positive publicity for Biden and for everybody who votes for it very quickly.
When, from a political science lens, and I think about you stepping into the classroom and teaching, how are you seeing so far Biden's first term here? He's
as you would expect, he is competent. He knows what he's doing. He's an experienced Washington hand. He's been, because he was vice president for 8 years, and he knows how the White House runs, he knows how agencies run, and because the Democrats were in office only 4 years ago, they were ready to take over. So, less so how is Biden doing and more how, we have partisan presidencies these days. What matters is the party much more so than the individual, unless the individual happens to be, say, Donald Trump.
Right.
But, Biden is sort of functioning as a typical Democrat, and he's doing what, any Democrat who was elected, or most Democrats who were elected coming into, with this Democratic Party would have done. What I do think is that he's done a pretty good job of, staffing up. His White House seems to be running pretty efficiently. He has experienced people. The congressional negotiators were, by all accounts, did a good job on this one. So he has all that going for him. Again, more of a party thing than an individual thing.
Is it the Biden of who spent most of his life in the Senate? Is that the Biden who we saw in the background here actually negotiating this? Or is this the result of, savvy people behind the scenes on Biden's team?
I don't mean to be talking down Biden. I think that the case is that for, the same was true of Barack Obama. The same was true for George W. Bush. It's really a team effort. Biden certainly taking the lead, calling the shots in terms of final decisions, but that his job is to sort of get the things in place and to, implement the party agenda as best he can. And I think that, the Democratic Party was in fairly good shape coming into his presidency, as opposed to, say, Bill Clinton, who was a very talented politician, but he took office after the Democrats had been out of office for 12 years, after, the previous one was Jimmy Carter, who everybody agreed was terrible.
Right.
He had to sort of start up from scratch. Biden, in many cases, is just promoting, the assistant from the last administration to be the principal of this administration.
All right. Listen, got to leave it there. Hey, good column, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Bloomberg opinion columnist Jonathan Bernstein covers and writes about politics and policy and is taught political science at the University of Texas at San Antonio and more, joining us on the phone from San Antonio. In the meantime, let's get to world and national news.
Nancy Lyons is in D.C. Hey there, Nancy.
Hey, thanks, Tim. We're waiting to hear Judge Peter Cahill sentence Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. Cahill has been hearing victims' impact statements from 4 people, including Floyd's 7-year-old daughter, Gianna, as well as his brother, Philonise.
I'm asking that you please find it suitable to give Officer Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, charge that he has been found guilty for. My family and I have been given a life sentence. We will never be able to get George back.
Prosecutors have asked for a 30-year sentence, while defense attorneys have requested probation. We'll bring you the verdict live here on Bloomberg Radio. The Justice Department is filing a lawsuit against a sweeping new Republican-backed voting law in Georgia. Attorney General Merrick Garland says it represents intentional discrimination against black voters, and he says it is unconstitutional.
This lawsuit is the first of many steps we are taking to ensure that all eligible voters can cast a vote, that all lawful votes are counted, and that every voter has access to accurate information.
Garland says his department will also issue a directive to all federal prosecutors and the FBI, instructing them to prioritize any threats against election officials. Manhattan prosecutors have informed Donald Trump's company it could soon face criminal charges stemming from a long-running investigation into the former president's business dealings. The New York Times reports charges could be filed related to fringe benefits the company gave to top executives. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now let's go to Doug Krisner, who has a business flash.
Hey, Nancy, thank you. We've got the big banks moving higher. The S&P Financials Index right now up by 1.4%. It was late yesterday we learned the big banks passed the latest stress test from the Fed, and now we are bracing for announcements next week on dividends and stock buybacks. The strength in financials leading the S&P 500 higher by about 0.4%. So technically we're extending a record here at 4,284. We have the Dow rising by 0.8%. Nike shares leading this rise. Nike at an all-time high after the company projected revenue this fiscal year will surpass $50 billion for the first time. Nike shares up more than 15%. Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger is predicting the chip shortage will bottom out in the second half of this year before beginning to improve. Now, we had a big move yesterday in the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index. Right now, the index is higher by just 0.1%. Long-term interest rates moving up with a 10-year Treasury yielding 1.52%. And crude oil now in New York just under $74 a barrel. I'm Doug Krisner. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Doug, thank you so much. Just a reminder, we are awaiting sentencing of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. He will be sentenced any moment now. Right now, we are monitoring the courtroom in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His defense attorney, Eric Nelson, making some comments right now. He did say that his remarks would be brief. Not clear if this means that Derek Chauvin will not address the court himself. Eric Nelson, though, saying this case is at the epicenter of a cultural and political divide. Chauvin is expected to face decades in prison, possibly 40 years. Of course, as you recall, he was found guilty of all charges: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter. But again, we will take you there live to the sentencing.
In the meantime, let's talk a little bit about cryptocurrency and blockchain. Taking a look at the price right now of Bitcoin, it's at $32,000, 300 and some change, down just about $2,500 today. Joining us now is Chainalysis co-founder and CEO Michael Groninger. Excuse me, Michael. Thanks so much for joining us today. Company tapped another $100 million. The valuation has jumped to $4.2 billion from $2 billion just back in March. A ton of interest. What was the story that you told investors in this latest round of funding?
Thanks. Yeah. So when I look at the crypto industry, and you've seen the crypto industry as well, it's clearly been booming over the last year or so. And what has become clear is that this is a mega trend. It's growing. Crypto is going to eat the world of finance, just as software ate the rest of the world. And what we told as a story, and what is like the core of what we are doing, is data. So we are building out a data platform for crypto. And what we've been doing so far has been helping the public sector in keeping the world safe for any crime in crypto. We've been helping private companies with doing their compliance. And now we are moving into what I would call financial data analytics or market intel, using data to actually gain more opportunities in crypto than before.
It is a very cool firm that you are running. It's a blockchain tracking and forensic firm. Your clients are government investigators, crypto exchanges, financial institutions. What's going to be the bigger part of your business? Is it ferreting out crypto situations that need to be investigated, or is it about, giving investors clues on when to buy or sell cryptocurrency?
So I think right now we are clearly our biggest customer base today and the biggest revenue we have today is the public sector. The public sector had an urgent need to be able to trace cryptocurrencies, to basically clean up the early industry of crypto, but also we've seen big ransomware attacks. Alone this year, we traced more than $100 million in that. So long term is going to be the private sector, and we are seeing that growing tremendously right now. And the public sector is growing 100%. The other one will outgrow that pretty fast.
What specifically, when you talk about the financial sector, is just the amount of activity of people investing in various cryptocurrencies? How do you see it? Where is it that, what are the specific ways that you anticipate you'll be making money?
So in the crypto trading, if you trade cryptocurrencies, if you want to enter that game, you are, as a financial institution, as an investor, you want to understand what your risks and opportunities are. You want to understand what could happen in crypto tomorrow. What are the flaws in the market currently? What is potential movement of the price? Is it retail driven right now, or is it institutional driven? You want to understand that when you model out your different products that you're going to offer to retail. So that could be loans, it could be other things that you're offering as a financial institution. And for all of that, you need data, and that's what we sell.
Because this is so new, and it's so new to so many people, and so many people don't necessarily understand the implications around blockchain and don't understand the intricacies of cryptocurrency, do you get concerned when you see headlines like Bitcoin falling 50% in a matter of weeks, that people will lose interest because of volatility?
So I've been in crypto for 10 years, and I've seen this high volatility. And I've also seen people saying Bitcoin is dead a million times. It doesn't really scare me. I think what we're actually seeing is that this trend of high volatility is tied to a 24/7 trading culture where retail has suddenly a high part of that. And we see that in Robinhood with GameStop, right? It's kind of crypto in the mainstream trading world, just with the normal shares. So I say that I'm not concerned. I actually think everything is going in that direction.
Is it a good thing that there's so much retail activity, that Robinhood traders can have such easy access to trading crypto? And look, 24/7, they can do it.
I think it's amazing. It's basically enabling the entire world to get access to financial instruments that we never dreamt that a retail investor would have access to before. So I think it's great. It's democratizing finance.
You talked about data that's going to be so useful when it comes to the cryptocurrency world. What kind of data specifically? What's the data that you're gathering that is going to be so important and crucial to your financial clients down the road?
So the blockchain is unique, and all the blockchains, Ethereum, Bitcoin, and so on, they're unique in its only public transaction system where all the transactions are public. So you can see every single transaction. It doesn't mean it's easy to understand. What we are able to do is we can build personas from a series and groups of transactions, and those personas indicate certain behaviors, and from those behaviors we can categorize them and say something about what is happening in the market right now. We can say something about compliance and risk and criminal activity, but we can also say something about what is the sentiment right now, what is happening, what are people doing. Are big investors trying to hodl more cryptocurrencies? Are they cashing in? So we can see those things on the blockchain data, and we're able to do that because we have amassed a lot of data around who's who over time.
All right, so Tim and I are like, wait, I want to go. But I do wonder, because I think about a guest we had earlier this week who said it's not the digital cryptocurrency world, it's not going to be the currencies we're talking about today. It's going to be something different down the road. Do you agree?
I think.
I mean, there are thousands out there right now, right? We know it's going to filter out.
Well, something will filter out. But also, I actually think what is happening is that you will consolidate what I would call a little handful of blockchains, but the number of tokens will grow 1,000x from now. You will have a token that represents your house. You will have a token that represents housing in Florida. You will have a token that represents other things. And there'll be so many various tokens. There'll be tokens for shoes, for items in games, everything. So I would say that's growing, but the number of blockchains will become smaller.
Back to Carol's question about data, because you shared so many ideas of the type of conclusions that this data can provide analysts, investors. Give me an example of sentiment right now. Give me an example of what you've been able to find by tapping into this data.
Yeah, so when we look at what happens over the last half year or so, where we saw very big institutional investors entering the crypto space, we've seen where they have bought their cryptocurrency. We've seen what is the average price that a MicroStrategy, that Tesla, that Square have bought their cryptocurrencies at, and that builds a flow into the market. It basically said either they should really turn around and say take a huge loss and sell it all, or they're going to defend that. And then when we look at the blockchain, we actually see that there is a buying that happens when we get down to where we are right now in price. Then institutional investors that got in at a higher price starts to buy, because it actually still makes the average price for Bitcoin smaller. And if the long-term believer is that this is going to go to 100K and above, then it's a good decision.
I have to say, I keep trying to figure out, Michael, it reminds me of the cable companies and the streamers. And at one point people were like, doesn't matter what the content is, it just, everybody's going to, oh, actually, we're going to take you, forgive me, we're going to take you to Minneapolis and the sentencing of police officer Derek Chauvin. Let's listen in.
And so I turn it over to you and your attorney.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
And I'll note that I did read your comments in the pre-sentence investigation as well.
Thanks, Fred.
All right, we are going to take a 15-minute recess so that I can complete the sentencing order based on what I've heard today. And let's reconvene at 2:45. We're in recess.
All right, that, of course, the last words, Judge Peter Cahill. Just before him, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin getting up, and I was timing it, I think it was maybe 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds. He made some very brief comments and was very somber, no doubt about it, but talking about that he couldn't say much, but that there would be more information coming in the future that he really couldn't talk about, and that was kind of it.
Yeah, he did say that he hoped that the information that comes does give some peace of mind. But as June Grasso told us earlier, Carol, it's unlikely that he would say anything because of the ongoing civil litigation.
Right, exactly. And it's very tricky. Prior to him was his defense attorney, Eric Nelson, making some comments and, things that were put out there before in order to either get a new trial. Eric Nelson saying earlier that Derek Chauvin's brain is littered with what ifs. Also saying Derek Chauvin was not even scheduled to work on May 25th, 2020. He volunteered because there was short staffing at the time, pointing out he's not coming into this as a career criminal. Or Tina Davis, who's executive editor of legal here at Bloomberg News, saying having no prior convictions is one argument to ultimately reduce any sentence. Eric Nelson also talking about Chauvin being a decorated police officer and he liked to help people.
We should note the court is taking a 15-minute recess right now while the judge does finish the sentencing guidelines, but we are expected to hear Derek Chauvin's sentence in the next 15 minutes.
Right, 15 minutes. The clock is setting, so approximately 3:45 Wall Street time, we will anticipate hearing the sentencing of Derek Chauvin. In the meantime, we do want to remind you we've got a trading day getting ready to wrap up the trading week. Just about 30 minutes to go. Let's check in with Doug Krisner.
Hey, Carol, we see a lot of strength among financials today. The S&P 500 being led higher by the S&P Financials Group. We know now that the big banks have passed the latest stress test from the Fed. Next week, we'll get announcements on dividends and stock buybacks. So right now, the S&P 500 at a record high, 42.81. The gain is about 0.4%. Now, Infotech has been kind of on the back foot for the entire trading day, and as a result, we've had the NASDAQ composite kind of fluctuating between gains and losses after a record yesterday. Right now, the index is essentially flat at 14,370. Dow Industrial Average right now ahead by 0.7%. We're looking at shares in Nike at an all-time high, helping to lead this advance. In the minus column, though, FedEx shares down about 4%. The company late yesterday talking about cost pressures tied to surging deliveries, and at the same time, FedEx saying that capital expenditures will increase by more than 20% during the fiscal year 2022. Look at shares in Virgin Galactic right now up 38%. The company has been cleared by the FAA to fly customers into space. 10-year Treasury right now with a yield of 1.53%. I'm Doug Krisner. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much, Doug Krisner. This is Bloomberg.
It's not Led Zeppelin.
It is Led Zeppelin.
Is this this Robert Plant?
Yes, and
Jimmy Page also?
Yes.
Wow. I was wondering if it was Led Zeppelin, and I was like, Dave would never be that kind to me. And,
I just wanted to give you a chance to redeem yourself on a Friday, Tim.
I did it. I haven't watched the documentary yet, Dave.
Well,
Vacation
that's for
next
the weekend.
week. I will watch it.
Okay, whenever. You'll get around to it.
Whenever. Kind soul, though. That was really cool that you did that. Whatever is that?
Well, nobody's fault but mine. That's what we're talking about.
Okay. I was
so,
asking, was this
sort of in the
70s?
middle. I mean, it's all the 70s one way or another, pretty much, because, the band broke up after the death of John Bonham, and that was right at the beginning of the 80s, so.
Wasn't the same, that's for sure.
No,
right?
absolutely.
It's hard to. All right, so, the name of the song you said again?
Nobody's fault but mine.
So talk to us and how that relates to the chart.
Well, I'm not so sure it does. It more relates to yesterday, but in any case, the chart focuses in on earnings and sort of looks at a contrast between what's going on with companies in the S&P 500 and what's going on in the broader U.S. economy. It's a contrast that Albert Edwards, who's a global strategist at Societe Generale, had in his latest report. Now, understand, he tends to be a pretty bearish guy, or he has for the better part of a quarter century, so he's kind of looking for ways to, justify his bearishness to some extent. And one of the things he points out is if you look at, say the forward earnings on the S&P 500, in other words, projected profits as opposed to historical results, that, you've seen a real pickup over the past year or so. In fact, up 52% from the low of last year, according to our data. And yet, if you look in the broader U.S. economy, and there are numbers compiled by the Commerce Department on that, you don't see much in the way of a recovery actually going across several years. There's been much more growth exhibited by the S&P 500 than there has been by companies in general. Now, you can argue there's a bit of a mismatch. You're looking at, future earnings as opposed to past earnings, and there are a number of reasons why, the comparison only goes so far. It's just an interesting kind of contrast.
He's chomping at the bit.
I am, because the diversion between these two lines is really stark over the last few months. And I'm wondering if this is a story about, there is so much money out there right now, and it's going to I hate to say it, Dave. There is no alternative, right?
Well, I mean, think of it in terms of earnings, though, Tim. Biggest companies in the S&P 500 have been leaders in terms of things like earnings and sales growth for the most part. So that kind of skews the comparison. And Edwards pointed this out, so it's not just me making it up. So that's a piece of it. And then beyond that, I mean, it's just the idea you're talking about a limited slice of the U.S. economy, much more global in a lot of cases. You know, these companies are, and so that's another piece.
I was going to say the profit projections from the Commerce Department, how reliable are they?
Well, understand, we're looking at historical figures on a quarterly basis. So, like I said, you're comparing the past to the future, so there's a bit of a mismatch there. But, you know, Edwards, even so, I mean, the words extremely concerning, that's what he used in terms of this contrast. So, you know, I mean, you can argue that, you know, it's a matter of his mindset, but it is something that is at least noteworthy. And if you want to know more, folks, send me an email. I'll get you this chart, the explanation that goes with it, and everything I do going forward. The email address is dwilson@bloomberg.net. That's dwilson@bloomberg.net.
Can we talk stock of the day?
We can.
Okay.
It's a company called Apogee Enterprises. The ticker is APOG. Windows, window frames, glass for picture frames. That's what we're talking about here. They came out with fiscal first quarter results, earnings and sales. Maybe not a surprise, beating analyst average estimates in Bloomberg survey, as the numbers tend to do. Wow. But more than that, you know, company raising full year forecasts as well. So, you know, the beat and raise quarters, when you get those going on, I mean, people do tend to like them a bit more. You know, and the company talked about how business recovered strongly from the pandemic-related issues of last year. We're going to see a lot of that, obviously, and they're dealing with higher raw material costs. They're dealing with higher transportation costs like a lot of other companies are. And yet, you know, the numbers are looking positive to analysts. So when you put that all together, I mean, you got Apogee shares at a 21-month high, and at the moment, they're up more than 12.5%.
Up 37% this year. Well, this plays into people redoing homes, right? There's demand. There's a lot of construction going on, and they're mostly in the U.S., right? But a little bit of global exposure, but that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen this with a number of other companies associated with home building in one way or another, and, you know, Apogee fits that theme.
The company also offers storefront and curtain wall systems. So there is this, not necessarily enterprise, but like a corporate business here. So that could play into a recovery. If we do start to see that recovery in cities across the world, as Carol mentioned, it does serve customers in the U.S., Brazil, and in Canada.
I love the small market cap, or it's like, yeah, right, 1.1 or a little bit over $1 billion in terms of market cap.
It's a company that no doubt will stay in the Russell 2000 after the reconstitution happens.
I thought about that. Dave ties it up. Is there one headline, Tim and I were talking about, like GameStop, like one headline in particular that you're going to be watching out for?
What do they do with AMC?
Yeah.
Because May 7th is when they set the date for market value to determine who goes in the Russell 1000 and the Russell 2000. AMC was like $4.5 billion. Now they're $28 billion.
It's crazy.
It is. But they're way above the, you know, what anyone would consider to be, you know, the small cap universe, which is what the Russell 2000 is supposed to represent. So how do they deal with that?
But Dave, very briefly, if it does stay in the Russell 2000, and let's say there is sort of this fall in the value of the company, then that could have a significant effect on people who hold that small cap index.
Absolutely. I mean, those are the sorts of issues that you know, you got to walk through.
It's a big portion of it right now.
And then could it be, and then any kind of other rebalancing? It's another year?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's a once-a-year process.
All right, well, good stuff. It'll keep us on our toes on this Friday when we're all thinking about the beach and ice cream.
Well, look for Dave's Stock of the Day just after 4:15 p.m. at Wall Street Journal on Facebook, LinkedIn, and on Twitter at @TheOneDave. Not yet time for the beach and ice cream yet,
All right,
Carol.
so maybe I'm thinking about beach and the ice cream. All right, Dave, have a great weekend. Our own Dave Wilson. All right, let's get back to world and national news. A lot going on, some serious stuff, of course. Nancy Lyons all over it. Hey, Nancy.
Yes, Carol. Thanks. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is set to learn his fate as a Minnesota judge sentences him for murder in the death of George Floyd. Before handing down the sentence, Judge Peter Cahill heard from Floyd's family and also from Chauvin's mother.
Derek is a quiet, thoughtful, honorable, and selfless man. He has a big heart and he always has put others before his own. The public will never know the loving and caring man he is.
Carolyn Palenti says she'll never waver from believing in her son's innocence. Chauvin himself spoke briefly and gave condolences to the Floyd family. Officials say there are still 159 people unaccounted for after the partial collapse of a beachside building in Florida. Miami-Dade Mayor Daniela Levine Cava says the search is a very delicate process.
It has to be done very, very carefully. They can't dislodge pieces of debris that could injure them in the process.
Cava says the community is fully behind the rescuers as they take on the risky work ahead. Virgin Galactic is the latest company to receive government approval to launch customers into space. Richard Branson's rocket ship company says the FAA has approved allowing it to launch from New Mexico. Unlike its competitors that use capsules launched from the ground, Virgin Galactic uses a winged spacecraft that launches from the belly of an airplane. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts.
Thank you so much, Nancy Lyons. Well, it does look like we are off of session highs for the S&P 500, but pretty close to them. Let's get a check on the trading day with Doug Krisner. Hey, Doug.
Hey, Tim. Yeah, it's been an interesting session. Right now, we have the S&P extending a record by about 0.4% at 42,082. This with about 18 minutes to go until the closing bell. The Dow is higher by full and let's call it 0.8%. Nike helping to lead this advance. Nike shares rallying after the company projected revenue this fiscal year will surpass $50 billion for the first time. Nike stock is up about 15%. We also have shares in Virgin Galactic Holdings soaring. The company has been cleared by the FAA to give customers a flight in space. Virgin Galactic shares right now higher by 38%. Some tech weakness, though, sending the NASDAQ comp lower by 0.1%. And we have a move up in long-term interest rates today with the 10-year Treasury now at 152. I'm Doug Krisner. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Doug Krisner, thank you so much. Just about 18 minutes left in today's trading session. We want to go to it and talk a little bit about the markets. Christian Manufo, he is Chief Investment Officer at Liberty Street Advisors, Portfolio Manager of the Private Shares Fund. He joins us on the phone from New York City. I believe it's Manufo, so forgive me, Christian. I want to make sure we've got it right. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having us on, and thanks for correcting it.
You bet. We like to get it right. So talk to us about getting it right in the markets right now, because, you know, it's easy when things are really, really bad to kind of know what's going on. It's easy when things are really, really good. But when we're kind of in this middle area where we've got Fed speakers all saying to some extent different things, it's hard, and economic data points telling us different things about the outcome or the outlook. It's hard to kind of figure out exactly what's the right play, although investors seem to be pretty much buying into the recovery trade today.
Yeah, they sure are. Yeah, and our focus is primarily on the private markets as well. And there's typically a bit of a lag effect we see when we have public market activity and macro events and the way in which they impact the private markets. But everyone is keeping a close eye on all these critical macro events that you point out. You know, from a private market standpoint, and particularly as it relates to late-stage venture and growth companies, we've continued to be pleased with how resilient this ecosystem has been throughout this period while waiting for more transparency, to your point, on how things really are going to develop over the coming months and quarters. You know, we continue seeing significant capital invested in this asset class. Most of the companies, I think, whether they're public or private, are really trying to balance managing high growth, but also their margins to maximize profitability where they can. And in the private markets, we continue seeing very strong exit activity. The public market clearly continues to support these companies. I think we would all agree that some of the activity got out of hand.
Yeah.
Which is healthy.
Look, I think that a lot of people would argue, wait a second, what happened with SPACs over the last year has really been a boon for, look, any company that's private right now that's looking for an infusion of capital and looking to go public but not do an IPO. I'm wondering how SPACs have changed the game for someone like you.
Yeah, they certainly have. You know, there's two elements to the equation. Part of it is that SPACs and PIPEs in parallel, to some degree, have actually pulled forward what typically would have been a more protracted exit event for these private companies. And so, you know, what many of us call pre-IPO financings in some situations have been replaced by the SPACs and IPOs, which can create more competition. We're also seeing more activity amongst public investors and what we call crossover investors, so public-private guys getting involved in private markets earlier to stake a claim in these companies. And I think SPACs had a major impact in that as well. And, we're seeing, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, so you think SPACs are a good thing?
Net, we do. In order to provide this ecosystem with more access to capital and more access to liquidity paths, we do think it's a net positive.
Right.
But we absolutely also think that the rising tide lifted all ships, and some of them will sink. Because I
don't, and forgive me, I know, because there's a lot of controversy, I feel like, about SPACs at this point, or not me, but just our reporting. You've certainly seen it in the SPAC. If you look at some of the indexes, the performance. Is there, though, the concern, Christian, that there's a lot of money coming from a lot of different places, SPACs included, chasing, few ideas, and that's going to create distortion in the markets, and that's going to create problems later on, or there's going to be some significant fallout?
Yeah, what we would agree with is the fact that not all of these are going to work out. And some of these companies in particular that went out with very little, if any, revenue off of 5 to 7 year forward-looking projections, which is incredibly difficult to underwrite for most investors, we think those are the ones that are the most vulnerable to get pullbacks. And I think you see some of those SPACs trading below the $10 mark. But there's a lot of companies that have much more attractive metrics and growth and maturity that are still deciding to go down the SPAC path for a variety of reasons. And so, look, we don't think it's going to be the only solution, but having an additional option in addition to traditional IPOs, which many have agreed would historically have left a lot of chips on the table for investors, as well as direct private offerings, we think it's nice to have more optionality for the ecosystem.
Well, people who listen to this frequently know that this is something I bring up all the time. The idea that SPACs are nothing new, and that they've been around for years, but they're certainly in vogue and really having a moment right now. Do you think they're here to stay, or do you think that increased regulatory scrutiny, coupled with the idea that investors, might become more skeptical of them if they don't produce results, will cause them to decline in interest?
Yeah, time will tell. Our view is that we do believe they will be a permanent fixture. Now, whether or not they're going to continue at these types of rates, I think that's a much harder question to answer right now. But they are solving for some issues in terms of the lack of IPOs to really focus on future types of projections where companies actually have legitimate projections you can underwrite, and doing it in a much more time efficient manner. There are benefits to that. There's also benefits, many would argue, to direct offerings and listings. And as I said, there's some interesting data that shows if you look at venture-backed public offerings over the past couple of decades, there's been a pretty significant pop on the first day that these companies trade that existing investors were not very pleased with, because it meant that they gave up more of their business, right, at a lower valuation. And so SPACs, to some degree, and direct listings are trying to more accurately price them. They're not going to get it right every time, but we do see value in SPACs being in the market for a longer period of time.
So when it comes to the unicorns that are out there, potential unicorns that are out there, there's a lot of innovation, Christian, going on. We've talked to Kathy Wood, who has really given a lot of attention to the disruptive and innovation space. Whether you agree with her or not, she definitely has created a conversation and really fed into investor demand for people looking for disruptors. And we are seeing that certainly play out in our world. Among the companies that are out there, the types of industries, where do you find the best opportunities right now?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And we're seeing innovation in areas that you may not typically correlate with innovation. Things ranging from, things like agritech, right? Agricultural technology. Mm-hmm. We're seeing fantastic
That's
applications.
A huge area, right? And really, I think, just at the cusp.
It really is. And we're very nascent in that market, and looking at things ranging from better sustainability to carbon utilization, to water and soil preservation, using more direct and non-invasive type of chemicals and microbiomes to replace what can be very contaminated pesticides. So and then using the data across the farming industry to help farmers as well to increase their business efficiency directly with the end consumer. So we're seeing a lot of innovation there. Again, not an area you might typically think of. Supply chains, which I think we're all looking at, dealing with bottlenecks. There's a lot of interesting technology and innovation that's being applied to supply chains,
right,
transportation, right, all sorts of logistical management. And then everything that we know, right, ranging from cybersecurity to fintech to education technologies. There's a lot of innovation that we continue to focus on.
When it comes to agri-tech, Larry Fink of BlackRock had talked about when it comes to kind of making a greener society that all the technology isn't quite in place. And that's why you might see some food inflation in particular, because we just don't have the necessary modalities in place, the technology in place to kind of do it efficiently. Having said that, are you also finding opportunity in kind of the data collectors who are helping guide policy? I recently talked to the founder of Grow Intelligence, and that's what she's all about. She comes from the commodity space, and she is all in on providing data to governments and everybody in the food chain to figure out ways to do things that helps the client and produces the food the world needs in a sustainable way.
That is spot on. We're seeing a significant amount of capital being invested into technology stacks that are aggregating
Christian,
data.
Forgive me,
Sure.
I've got to interrupt because we're going to go to Minneapolis and Judge Peter Cahill getting ready to make the sentencing in former Minneapolis police Derek Chauvin. Let's take you there.
Not just the people who were in the courtroom here, but also those who provided written statements, both from the Floyd family and the defendant's family. I've read all the impact statements that were submitted earlier and listened carefully to all the input here today. And it is truly appreciated that you took the time to stay with this case and to provide me with input. I have reviewed the pre-sentence investigation and carefully considered all the facts of the case and the law. But my comments are actually going to be very brief because most of it's going to be in writing. I have a 22-page memorandum that is going to be attached to the sentencing order. And why am I doing it in writing? To emphasize the fact that determining the appropriate sentence in any case, and in this case, is a legal analysis. It's applying the rule of law to the facts of an individual and specific case. And that is why, as opposed to trying to being profound here on the record, I prefer that you read the legal analysis that explains how I determined the sentence in this case. What the case is, or what the sentence is not based on, is emotion or sympathy. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family. You have our sympathies. And I acknowledge and hear the pain that you are feeling. I acknowledge the pain not only of those in this courtroom, but the Floyd family who are outside this courtroom and other members of the community. It has been painful throughout Hennepin County, throughout the state of Minnesota, and even the country. But most importantly, we need to recognize the pain of the Floyd family. I'm not going to attempt to be profound or clever because it's not the appropriate time. I'm not basing my sentence also on public opinion. I'm not basing it on any attempt to send any messages. A trial court judge, the job of a trial court judge is to apply the law to specific facts and to deal with individual cases. And so, Mr. Chauvin, as to count one, based on the verdict of the jury, finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2 paren 1, it is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 60904, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentenced for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You are granted credit for 199 days already served. Pay the mandatory surcharge of $78 to be paid from prison wages. You are prohibited from possessing firearms, ammunition, or explosives for the remainder of your life. Provide a DNA sample as required by law. Register as a predatory offender as required by law. And then you will receive a copy of the order and also the attached memorandum explaining the court's analysis. Anything further from the state?
If this needs to be said, we just ask that it be executed forthwith.
Defendant is remanded to the custody of the sheriff to be transported back to the DOC or whichever custody is currently holding him. Anything from the defense? All right. Thank you. We are adjourned.
All right, you've been listening to Judge Peter Cahill giving the sentence for George Floyd's killer, Derek Chauvin, sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison, 270 months as the judge laid out on that count one, giving him credit for those 199 days served. This was widely expected that Judge Peter Cahill would be tough on Chauvin. You might recall back in May 11th, he ruled that the case met the standard for a higher than recommended prison term because Chauvin, quote, abused a position of trust and authority by using force that the jury determined was unreasonable. Well, our legal eagle here at Bloomberg News is our own June Grosso. And June, talk to us about that sentencing.
Well, I think the judge was really considerate in the way he handled this. And, you could see, we talked before about how everyone would be listening to what he said. And so what he decided to do is say very little and leave it to what he's written. And what people will have to do is go to that 22 pages that he said he wrote. But what he said was he's not basing it on public opinion, and he's not trying to send a message, and that he's a trial judge, and what he's doing is applying the law to the facts that he saw here. And with that, he added 10 years to the basic prison sentence. And by the way, he only sentenced him for the top count because the other counts, he said, were considered in the top count.
Explain that for those of us who don't have the legal knowledge that you have. Explain how that works.
Well, because really, they charged him in 3 different ways, but he's only really guilty. Even if he's guilty of all of them, it's really all subsumed or by the top count. So there's no need to, if he had sentenced for the lower counts as well, he would have said probably this is all concurrent. You'll serve these concurrently. But normally it's the top count that really excuse me, that really is the one that they sentence for, because otherwise you'd be sentencing him for the different ways for the same crime. So, for the murder of George Floyd, you'd be sentencing him for the murder, for manslaughter. It doesn't make sense. So under the law, this makes sense. He's sentencing for what's basically a felony murder charge. It's not called that in Minnesota, but that's basically what it is, where you commit a murder in the course of a felony. And then he considered the aggravating factors that we talked about before, the fact that he violated his public trust as a police officer, that this was done in front of young children, and the fact that it was done in a group, and that he was particularly cruel to George Floyd. And that helped to bring the sentence up to 22 and a half years, 10 years basically additional to the 12 and a half that, we said before, basically under Minnesota law for murder, it's a 12 and a half year sentence. So he added 10 years for the aggravating factors here. The prosecution wanted him to end up with 30 years. So he didn't go as high as the prosecution wanted. And I think he did it in a reasonable way. He treated this as he would a case that didn't have as much publicity as this, where he saw these factors. So I think that this is probably the best that Derek Chauvin could have hoped for in this case.
Hey, June, just in the last 30 seconds that we have with you, actually we have a little more time with you, but give us what your reaction to the 22-page memorandum that's attached to the order, because as a layperson, I was really surprised to hear that the judge was so brief in his comments and encouraged people to read the brief.
Well, the thing is that the judge here knows that it's sort of like when Mueller testified and he said very little, because he knew that they were going to be taking those sound bites and playing them over and over and over again everywhere. Oh. So I think the real reason is the judge didn't want to hear himself and analyzed on every television network, on every radio station, and in every newspaper. He didn't want to hear that. So instead, he put that into a memorandum where everything can be perfectly written out and the legal explanations can be there, and he's not going to be judged right away because people are right now probably reading through the memorandum. I haven't had a chance yet to see what his reasoning was, but that makes it to him, I think, a little more. This is just the law. I was the trial judge, and I executed the law, and I didn't pay attention to the rest of the noise going on.
Right. Hey, we are talking to June Grosso, Bloomberg News legal analyst, host of Bloomberg Law, on the Access Line in New York City. Just to reiterate, George Floyd's killer, Derek Chauvin, former Minneapolis police officer, was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. Judge Peter Cahill saying 270 months. That's the 22 and a half years that we're talking about. The sentence is 10 years more than what was called for in Minnesota guidelines, given that Derek Chauvin had no prior record. It is over, but it is interesting, and you could feel, June, certainly when Judge Peter Cahill was speaking, and I was kind of timing it, it was roughly maybe 4 minutes. It was very quick, and as you said, he said he would be brief in court, yet he hoped that people would read that 22 pages of memorandum that he put out that really laid out the law in this sentencing. You could feel the gravity of Judge Peter Cahill's comments. This has been a case from the get-go, since we've all seen that video, that you know that this is a moment in time, a symbol of a miscarriage of justice that will stay with us forever.
It will. And the judge is a very matter-of-fact jurist. He's a solid jurist, and he showed that throughout the trial. And as I said, I think that he briefly said what his decision was based on, that it was based on the facts he saw at trial and on the law. He didn't get into any kind of, histrionics. He didn't get into sympathy, except to say that, he's not basing it on public opinions, but it's important to recognize the pain of the Floyd family. And then we'll have to wait to read in his opinion what he wants to say. But what he is doing here is making sure that there aren't sound bites of what he's saying, really. There'll be a very small one. There'll be one that says, I'm not considering this or that, but it's not going to be played over and over again in history even. Yeah. So I think that he did a very good job of making it about the case, about the facts, about what happened here, rather than everything that's been happening around, as you said, around this case, making it a national issue and leading to, the call for racial justice and protests. He's trying to get away from that and say, here's what happened in the court of law. Here's what we decide based on.
If you're just joining us, we are speaking with June Grasso, our legal analyst and the host of Bloomberg Law here at Bloomberg Radio. We're talking about the 22.5-year sentence that Derek Chauvin has been issued by the judge in the murder of George Floyd. Of course, Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer, sentenced Friday to 22 years and 6 months in prison for murdering George Floyd. June, I'm curious about what happens next in the appeal here. Our own Tina Davis points out on the live blog that we're seeing right now that according to Richard Fraze, a criminal law professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, the judge knows that this case will be appealed. So I'm wondering what Chauvin's defense team does as he starts to serve out this sentence.
Well, I think it's very interesting. When we saw Derek Chauvin speak, he said other things are happening, and I think he's referring to the appeal and his upcoming federal civil rights trial, and that's why he said very little. But although it was a little unusual, he offered his condolences to the Floyd family, and but still didn't express any remorse, really. And I thought that was sort of lacking, and I think part of it is that maybe his personality, but also that his attorneys told him that here's what's coming, the appeal. They're already preparing the appeal. What happened is they asked for a retrial, and the same reasons that they used in the retrial are going to be the reasons that they asked for an appeal. So it's going to be, the judge should have changed the venue. He shouldn't have let this case be tried in Minneapolis with a courtroom behind barbed wire with all the people outside and protesting, that he should have moved the trial. Another thing is what we talked about before, which is one of the jurors not being candid during jury selection, in that he didn't mention he'd participated in a march last summer to honor Martin Luther King Jr., and that he hadn't been open enough in his views. Those are going to be, and also there were some issues during trial about giving evidence over whether there'd been enough notice. There were a lot of issues during the trial that they're going to bring up. In fact, they said that to the judge the last day of the trial, after the conviction had been handed down. They mentioned some things, and he said, I know you're going to bring that up on appeal. And all that's going to be on appeal, and they're preparing it if it's not prepared already.
Right, exactly. June, what did you make of Derek Chauvin actually getting up for just seconds? It was very, very brief, making some comments. Were you surprised that he actually said something?
I was surprised because he really didn't say much.
Right.
If he was going to stand up and say something, he should have said a little bit more. I think he should have at least said he was sorry for what happened. I mean, he'd be able to say that without making any, concessions, really. Everyone's sorry for what happened. So I was surprised that he stood up, and then I was surprised again that when he he stood up, he didn't say very much. He didn't say anything that would allow people to say, well, he's sorry for what he did. And, as his mother, what they did here was interesting. They used his mother instead of him to express what she says he felt. She said this has been weighing on him. It's been bothering him. So and that he's not a person that they make him out to be. He's a man who's devoted to the police. So she gave the statement that you would ordinarily hear from the defendant. It came from her. So I thought that was an interesting thing to do.
Wow.
And what he said wasn't enough. So if I were his lawyer, I would have said sit down. But I think they wanted to prevent people from saying, oh, he didn't even say anything.
Well, I will say another big moment in what has been a big year for so many different reasons. But of course, since we all saw the death and killing of George Floyd. June, thank you so much for really walking us through all of the legal statements and understanding what happened on this Friday. June Grosso, she's Bloomberg News legal analyst, host of Bloomberg Law on the Access Line from New York City. Again, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison for the murder of George Floyd. Having said that, the market has closed. We did wrap up the trading week, and on a day where we really saw the recovery trade in full play. As for the S&P 500, closing just up about 14 points, just off its highs of the session, but near it, up 1/3% at 4,280. Dow Jones Industrial Average, Tim, up 237 points, again of 0.7%, 34,433. NASDAQ, the decliner for the day, just down a hair, down 9 points at 14,360. You looking at the weekly numbers?
Yeah, I'm looking at the weekly numbers. I should note a record close for the S&P 500, but wow, what a difference a week makes, Carol. The Dow finishing the week higher by more than 3.4%, S&P 500 higher by more than 2.7%, and the NASDAQ finishing out the week, just the last 5 days, by more than 2.3%.
And it was a week full of a lot of Fed speak, and sometimes Fed speakers that agreed in terms of what's happening with inflation, transitory or not. Others were concerned and talking about maybe we get rate increases sooner rather than later. Markets, though, by the end, obviously feeling much more comfortable about inflation concerns. And again, we get data points that point to, yes, we are recovering, but sometimes it's not as strong as everybody would hope.
Also economic data that shows, indeed, consumers are thinking that the inflationary pressures that we're seeing right now is transitory, even if we are seeing companies like FedEx say, hey, we are going to have to pay more to wages. Companies like Southwest Airlines saying that they are increasing their minimum wage to $15 an hour in order to attract that talent.
18 days away from, you know what?
What is, bank earnings?
Yeah, JP Morgan will
Is that
report.
right? Is that right? Wow.
On July 13th in the morning. So we will start to get a clearer indication of how companies are doing, what they see in terms of visibility over the next 6 to 12 months. That's going to be key in the next direction, or the next leg of direction when it comes to the financial markets.
Financials leading
You're
the way.
Gonna be gone.
I'm gone.
Okay, I know how to find you.
You do.
I will leave you alone. Get a break because there's a lot going on.
I will see you in July.
Enjoy, be safe.
Thank you.
All right, my host, Tim Stenevec, here on Bloomberg Business Week. Let's get to world and national news. A lot going on this Friday. Nancy Lyons is all over it. Hey, Nance.
Hey, Carol. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin has been sentenced into the death of George Floyd. You heard it here. Judge Peter Cahill saying his decision was not based on emotion or sympathy, but on the law.
The court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd.
That amounts to 22 and a half years in prison. Prosecutors had asked for 30. Before today's sentencing, video impact statements were given, including one from Floyd's 7-year-old daughter, Gianna.
Do you wish that he was still here with us?
Yeah, but he is.
Through his spirit?
Yes.
Yes.
Gianna also said she misses and loves her father. Chauvin himself spoke briefly and offered his condolences to the family. Search and rescue teams are using dogs and microphones in their search as they detect sounds coming from rubble of the collapsed beachside condo complex near Miami. Hopes of finding survivors are dwindling. The death toll now up to 4, with 159 people now unaccounted for. Global news, 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Nancy Lyons, thank you so much. You are listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Well, we had an IPO this week, Doximity. It's the digital platform for U.S. medical professionals. It doubled in its first day of trading yesterday, up another 5.6% in today's session. And our Bloomberg Business Week weekend show features our interview with the company's CFO, Anna Bryson. In this excerpt, she talks about how the Doximity platform helped doctors during the pandemic.
These physicians have long been using our tools for a multitude of years. We've been in place for 2010. And during the pandemic, when physicians couldn't see any of their patients face to face, they started using our telehealth tools dramatically at a much faster pace. And we were really proud to do our part in the pandemic and give back. And we actually didn't even start charging for any of the telehealth features at all, even to our health systems, until January 1st. So we really gave it away for free for those first 8 or 9 months of the pandemic, and that was really, really critical for us. We were very proud to do that.
It sounds like, Anna, ultimately, I think about companies that outsource back office operations or customer service operations, and it feels like in many ways you guys are looking to do that for the medical community, doctors specifically, and the doctor communities at major hospitals. Is that what it's ultimately about?
That's exactly right. We have a multitude of ways in which physicians can use us, but we want to enable them to collaborate with their colleagues, stay up to date with the latest medical news and research. They can manage their careers. They can conduct virtual patient visits. We're replacing that fax machine and some of the more antiquated technology that they've been using for so long, and we're trying to be a smartphone hub really for them.
And that was Anna Bryson. She's the Chief Financial Officer at Doximity, the digital platform for U.S. medical professionals. And you can hear more of that interview. It's on our Bloomberg Business Week weekend show on Bloomberg Radio. Catch that Saturday morning, and also on our podcast feed at Bloomberg.com. As I mentioned, Doximity was up 103%, almost 104% in that first day of trading yesterday, so more than doubling, and up another 5.6% in today's trade. It IPO'd at $26, closed today at $55.98 a share. You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week. I'm Carol Masser, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
So we had a record high today for the S&P 500. Its best week since April, with a gain of about 2.7% for the last 5 trading days. But overall, the market was mixed. We had a little bit of weakness in information tech stocks, pulling the NASDAQ composite down from a record high by about 10, let's call it 1/10%. The S&P, though, at a record 4,280 with a gain of 0.3%. And the S&P Financials Index today up nearly 1.3%. We know the big banks have passed that stress test. Now it's on to the announcement next week from the big banks on dividends and stock buybacks. Shares in Nike at an all-time high. The stock was up more than 15% today after the company projected revenue this fiscal year will surpass $50 billion for the first time. And it was really Nike that led the Dow higher by about 0.7%. In the bond market, meantime, we had a move up in long-term interest rates. A 10-year Treasury adding about 3 basis points in yield to 152. I'm Doug Krisner. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Doug, appreciate that recap. Doug Krisner there with the Bloomberg Business News Flash. We did get a check, you might recall, on the U.S. labor market yesterday, as we always do on Thursdays, weekly jobless claims. Seeing the labor market road to recovery, it's a bumpy one. It's something Fed Chair Jay Powell is focusing on. The data points show that applications for U.S. state unemployment insurance fell slightly last week, though were higher than forecast as the labor market meanders toward a full recovery. That is our environment. One of our go-to voices for us when it comes to the workforce is someone who I will be sitting down with for an in-depth conversation with a small group of business leaders at our upcoming work shifting roundtable that's happening next Tuesday, June 29th. Becky Frankowitz is back with us, president at Manpower Group North America. She's on the phone from Chicago. Becky, nice to have you here. I'm looking forward to our conversation because as we all increasingly get back to the office, and there's still a lot who have to get back there or may get back there come fall when kids go back to school, we're still trying to find our way about what it will be. Will we be working at home maybe? Will we be at the office? So how are you seeing it? What are you hearing from folks who are looking to make some hires?
Yes, Carol, hi. Very much looking forward to joining you next week as well. And I think you said 2 key words, bumpy and meandering. So I would say, when we spoke last month, I said this is increasingly a workers' market. And at that point, it seemed like a pretty bold statement. Mm-hmm. And yet I would say it's even more true today. It is clear that right now we have an acute talent shortage, and that's driven by supply, very complex, which we can talk about. But that's across all sectors, Carol. So it's, people think, oh, that's white collar. No, it's white collar, it's blue collar, and people are voting with their skills. Just this week, I was at dinner with my daughters, and we went to a little fast casual restaurant, and on the door, taped to the door, was, due to staffing shortages, we've adjusted our hours of operation. And they closed today. And so we're seeing this across the country. And again, it's the challenge is getting people to re-engage with the workforce. And subsidies is part of that. But you mentioned school, summer programs, help with childcare, and then fear of the virus remains.
So how does it change come September, Becky, when we assume a lot of schools will be back to normal, quote unquote, and kids will be back at school and parents can much more easily get back to work?
Yeah, so we're hoping for a September sunrise. So we hope as kids go to school, the American worker comes back to work. And in some cases, that'll be coming back into a building. And in a lot of cases, that'll be, re-engaging remotely with the workforce. But the problem we have to solve in our country is holding on to the workers that you have and attracting new workers. And that's not always attracting them from another company. Increasingly, it's attracting them from, back into the workforce from unemployment.
Interesting what you just said. Employers are having trouble holding on to workers. What's going on?
Yeah, so we've seen this evolution of what I'd say the, quote unquote greats. So it started out at the beginning of the crisis, Carol, with the great reallocation, the biggest workforce shift since World War II. Industries closed down, demand grew in other places. And then I would say, a bit of the middle journey was the great restart, where supply chains reopened, ports reopened, demand bounced back. We have 12 million open jobs in the country, and employers wanted to hire people. And now what's happening, and you've heard it called the Great Resignation, I don't think that's quite the right name for it, people looking for a change coming out of the crisis. I would call it the Great Reawakening, because this crisis has changed us. people are looking at work differently, and there's a reimagined sense of self, a reestablishment of priorities, and they're looking for work to fulfill a different role in their life, and that's something different than wages.
I think that's spot on, and I'm not quite sure that employers have caught up with that. And it's interesting, in our conversation that we're going to talk about next week, somebody in planning for it had said to me, we need to be thinking about work differently. In the Great Industrial Revolution required that people be in factories and be at work from 9 in the morning, 8 in the morning, 7 in the morning to whatever time at night. We needed to be working together. What the pandemic showed us is that we don't really have to be, that we have so many tools that enable us to work at any time and almost anywhere. But it doesn't necessarily feel like employers have really caught up to that.
Well, that is something we are counseling our clients on across the nation. I mean, you don't have to be together to work together. Mm-hmm. And it is a seismic shift in the way we think about how work gets done. But we have demonstrated since the crisis that we actually can do that. And, performance does not need to be tied to presenteeism, everyone working in the same place at the same hours.
So so what happens? I mean, are employers getting hip to it? And are we, the argument that happens is that, wait a minute, we're losing our culture. We're not as productive.
Yeah, so Carol, this was pre-crisis. I had a fascinating discussion because we've known that, this rise of the empowered worker was happening even pre-crisis. The crisis just accelerated it. And a prominent CEO asked me, Becky, how do you build culture when people aren't in the building? And my response even then was, the culture isn't contained in a building. The culture is contained in people. And technology has allowed us to actually connect in new and different ways. And so, the way forward is first and foremost, we have to recognize and accept that there have been seismic shifts that actually can move us forward versus going backwards, and you have to embrace that forward momentum. The other thing I would say is, to get workers in quickly and invite them back into the workforce, they're looking for fast cash, fast decisions, and a lot of flexibility. And, this idea of fast cash is they're not, they want to be paid immediately, not waiting.
I cannot wait to continue this conversation. Becky, thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Becky Frankowitz, she's president of Manpower Group North America, on the phone from Chicago. She's going to be joining me and a small group of other business leaders at our upcoming Work Shifting Roundtable. That's on Tuesday, June 29th. The full recording of that discussion will be available on the Bloomberg Live YouTube page after the event. Coming up, Becky was just talking about it, being in a restaurant and they have limited service because they can't get enough workers. Well, we're going to get a firsthand account of what's going on in the restaurant industry. We're going to do that with the CEO of PF Chang's. They've pivoted. They are reopening to-go locations. It's kind of changing a little bit about what they're doing in the restaurant space. That's coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week.
Broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York. Bloomberg 1130 to Washington, D.C. Bloomberg 99.1 to Boston. Bloomberg 106.1 to San Francisco. Bloomberg 960 to the country. Sirius XM Channel 119. And around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
All right, you listen to us a lot, so you know a couple of the spaces that we talk about a lot is the restaurant space, because we know it was really brought to its knees as a result of the pandemic. Really tough on the industry. And then they quickly learned to pivot. And we're going to check in with the CEO of P.F. Chang's, because that's exactly what they are doing. And we'll find out their strategy in just a moment. First up, though, let's get back to your top business stories, how the week ended up in trading. And it was kind of a good week, or I should say at least a bullish week.
I think if you look at the S&P 500, you could make that case, Carol. We finished at a record high today. It was the best week for the S&P since April. And I ran the GIP 5 function on the Bloomberg for the index. We were up a little more than 2.7% for the week. Now, in today's session, there was only one industry group within the S&P that was actually lower, information technology. So if you know that, it's not going to be a surprise to hear that the NASDAQ composite is down today, off from a record, incidentally, by just about 0.1%. So the NASDAQ comp at 14,360, but the S&P 4280. That's a record. The gain for the S&P 0.3%. Now, strong today in the broader market financials. We know the big banks have passed the stress test now. We're bracing next week for announcements on dividends and buybacks. Where the Dow is concerned, you really got to look at Nike. The stock was up more than 15%. We closed at an all-time high after Nike projected revenue for this fiscal year will surpass $50 billion for the first time. And the gain in Nike helping the Dow to a gain of about 0.7%. In the bond market, 10-year Treasury moving up by about 3 basis points in yield. We were last quoted in New York here at 1.52%. I'm Doug Krisner. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash.
Refinance that mortgage yet, Doug?
You know what? It was Eric Rosengren today, who's the president of the Boston Fed Bank.
Yeah.
He was seeing potential, or talking about potential risk in rising housing prices. He went on to say that it's got to be taken into account when the Fed sets monetary policy.
I know.
No, you don't know.
I do so. All right, Doug Krisner, thank you so much. Want to talk a little bit about the restaurant industry. Hit so hard by the pandemic. You know that many had to pivot, and they did that. And that included P.F. Chang's, which opened its first 3 P.F. Chang's to-go locations in New York City last fall. It's a smaller format, offering takeout, delivery, and catering, and they're doing the same in some other major cities. Let's get more on the strategy, how the industry is doing overall, and changing as a result of the pandemic. Damola Adamalekan, he is CEO of P.F. Chang's. He's on the phone in Scottsdale, Arizona. He's also partner at Paulson & Company, of course, the firm of the former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, and he's also at Triartisan Capital Advisors. Damola, so nice to have you here with us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you guys for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. First of all, this past year, tell me what it's been like for you all.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind, as you can imagine. So, we ramped down our dine-in business, last year in conjunction with the government mandates. We worked through that. We drove our off-premise business. We've gone through the worst of it. We're on the rebound now. And so excited to be in a position where we've gone through the storm and we're coming out on the other side.
Well, storms and moments of crisis sometimes teach us an awful lot of things, or figure out strategies that we were maybe thinking about, mulling over, and then all of a sudden we're like, we got to do them. How did the pandemic impact your thinking about what your business needs to be going forward?
Absolutely. So, we identified off-premise dining as a key area of focus for us prior to the pandemic. And so we opened our first to-go actually in February of last year, which coincidentally was about a month before to-go became the only way you could eat.
Was that Chicago that you did that?
Correct. That was in Chicago. It was in River North, Chicago. And so, we'd seen that growth, and consumers were shifting towards off-premise prior to COVID. It accelerated dramatically, obviously, with first of all, being forced to use it. But now, even as dine-in has come back, we've seen that off-premise continues to grow. So people have really changed their behavior in a much more permanent way than just temporarily as induced by COVID. Yep, go ahead.
Well, I want to ask you keep saying off-premise. So you're talking about takeout, right?
Yeah, sorry. So off-premise means takeout, but it also means delivery. So you don't actually come to the restaurant. You maybe order on our P.F. Chang's app or website or on one of the third-party apps. And it also means catering. So, a big event that you get catered, whether you call that in, order on the website, on the app. So it's takeout, delivery, and catering is what we call off-premise.
So what's doing the strongest? Is it takeout just in general or delivery?
Takeout's the biggest is biggest business out of those, but the most growth has come through delivery, and specifically delivery through our channels, so through our website and through our app. And part of that is purposeful. That's where we focused on growing the most. It allows us to interact directly with the consumer. It gets them the best experience, and it creates that one-on-one relationship that we cherish. So we focused on growing that. People have enjoyed, coming directly to us. And that's been the highest growth area, even though takeout is the biggest business of the three.
Well, it's interesting you talk about delivery because there's all those services, right? And that has definitely been a pandemic play as everybody was delivering takeout. But when you use those services, right, you lose a piece of your business. So if you can keep it in-house on your own platforms, first of all, as you said, you're directly involved with the consumer, but it's also then you get a bigger piece of the pie.
That's correct. You don't pay the fees, right? We have to deliver or solve for delivery, whether we pay somebody to do it on our behalf, like a DoorDash, or do it ourselves. But it's still more cost effective overall. Absolutely. But in addition to that, there's the question of being able to know who our guest is and know what they order, and be able to identify them when they come into a restaurant if they ordered from us on delivery a week ago. So there's an important data and consumer loyalty and analytics piece of it that we get by working directly with the guest. And then finally, we can give them a better price overall. Because the third parties have to charge a certain amount of delivery fees to kind of make their model work. We're able to do a lot better, frankly, because there's no middleman to deal with. So, for a number of reasons, it's a better experience for the guests, and it's in a better situation for us. And so that's where we've kind of focused our attention in terms of growth.
What kind of activity are you seeing here in New York? Because we're trying to assess what's going on in terms of people coming back to work here in New York City. We've got about 40 seconds. We'll do some news and then come back. But just initially, what kind of demand are you seeing, especially for lunch?
Yeah, we're seeing it start to rebound. I'm starting to see more catering orders come, which is a wonderful sign, and starting to see more lunch traffic pick up. Office was about 5 to 10% occupied through the first quarter of this year. That's starting to pick up. Our feeling is that Labor Day is kind of a flag, a marker that's been planted in terms of when folks will really start to come back into the office post summer holidays, et cetera. So we're seeing improvement, but really I think the step function improvement will occur likely around Labor Day, and that should be a wonderful time for all of us who live in or visit New York City.
Yeah, I feel like in so many ways we're all just going to put a big red circle around Labor Day in terms of what it means for the reopening of our economy and kind of going back to, quote unquote, more normal. Damola, sit tight. We're going to come back and continue our conversation with the CEO of PF Chang's. In the meantime, just a reminder of how we closed on this Friday. We did see a rally overall for the week. Dow Jones Industrial Average, though, up 237 points for the Friday trade, really the outperformer on a percentage basis for the Friday session. All right, let's get back to world and national news. For that, it's over to Nancy Lyons. She's in our 99.1 newsroom in D.C. Hey, Nance.
Hey, Carol. It is 22 and a half years in prison for Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer who was convicted in the murder of George Floyd. Prosecutors had asked for 30 years. Judge Peter Cahill handed down the sentence just a short time ago.
What the sentence is not based on is emotion or sympathy. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family.
Cahill says his 22-page memorandum will explain his thinking. He says Chauvin's abuse of authority and cruelty to Floyd enter into his decision. The Justice Department is taking Georgia to court over its new voting law. Attorney General Merrick Garland says the move fulfills a promise to protect voting rights, which he says is the key pillar of democracy.
Our complaint alleges that recent changes to Georgia's election laws were enacted with the purpose of denying or abridging the right of black Georgians to vote on account of their race or color in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Garland says the Georgia lawsuit is the first step to ensure that all eligible voters can cast a ballot and know their vote will count. Authorities in Spain say everything points to suicide in the death of security software tycoon John McAfee while in his jail cell. But his wife today demanded a thorough investigation of his death, saying her husband did not appear suicidal when they last spoke. McAfee was found dead just hours after a Spanish court approved his extradition to the U.S. on tax evasion charges. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take. I'm Nancy Lyons.
So a favorite voice of ours is Peter Atwater. He is someone who looks at today's world through both an economic and Wall Street lens. He is adjunct professor of economics at William & Mary. You know, you might remember he coined the term K-shaped recovery. He's also writing about the age of scrutiny, and he is on our Bloomberg Business Week weekend show. We had a conversation. Here's a clip of it where he talks about the next potential shakeup in the financial markets.
I've been watching, as I always do, human behavior, and it's been fascinating to see in this cycle, particularly in the last, say, 18, 24 months, where attention getting has been sort of the principal objective, whether you are a SPAC partner or a meme stock. The whole focus has moved to what I call illusion, that our business leaders are now trying to captivate an audience. And this is a very different cycle phenomenon. And it concerns me because at the same time you have all of these very charismatic, very powerful leaders talking about the promise in EVs and the promise in space and the promise in all of this futuristic technology, you're starting to see companies where that illusion was false.
And that is Peter Atwater. He is adjunct professor of economics at William & Mary. You can hear more of that interview. It will be on our weekend show on Bloomberg Radio on Saturday morning. You can also catch it on our podcast feed at Bloomberg.com. Peter, writes about, as we mentioned earlier, that K-shaped recovery. He's been spot on about that. He talks about this third major financial betrayal in 20 years. He says after the dot-com debacle and the housing crisis, the investment crowd will not take kindly to yet another bubble burst. So that's what he really explores, whether it's some of what we're seeing with SPACs and some of the meme stocks, but a lot going on. So check that out over the weekend and on our podcast feed. This is Bloomberg.
news, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It was strength in financial stocks that led the S&P 500 to a record high today. We closed 4280 with a gain of about 0.3%. And if you're keeping track of weekly performance, this was the best week for the S&P since April. For the last 5 trading days, we were up more than 2.7%. The Dow was higher by 0.7%. You got to credit Nike. Stock finishes at a record high today after jumping more than 15%. It was late yesterday that Nike reported revenue, or exactly projected revenue for this fiscal year, will surpass $50 billion for the first time. Information technology shares, though, weakened, and that was enough to pull the NASDAQ composite down from an all-time high by 0.1%. In the bond market, meantime, long-term interest rates move a bit higher, 10-year Treasury adding 3 basis points in yield. We were last quoted at 1.52%. And the dollar slightly weaker against the majors today, with the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index dropping about 0.1%. I'm Doug Prisner. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Dougie, thank you so much. You are listening to Bloomberg Business. You want to get back to our guest. We're talking with the CEO of PF Chang's, Damola Adamalekan. He is still with us on the phone in Scottsdale, Arizona. So, Damola, where do you go from here? How much do you expand this smaller model that you folks are doing at PF Chang's, this to-go locations, around the country?
Sure. So, we're going to ramp up the openings for that concept. It's been met with a lot of great enthusiasm in the markets where we've opened it. So we're intending to have 20 open by the end of this year.
Wow.
We have eight at present. So we have, have about 12 that we're going to open, for the rest of the year. And that's going to be mostly concentrated in the Dallas and the Florida markets. We have one actually opening next week in Las Colinas in Dallas. And so that's the plan. And then going forward for next year, we'll open about 30 and ramp up this concept, fairly quickly here. And to be able to reach more consumers in more parts of the country a lot more quickly.
All right, so it sounds like you're trying to reach out to consumers in a big way. Is the end game also ultimately spinning this puppy off and going public?
No, not to spin it off. So we manage this. The secret sauce here is that it's the same exact PF Chang's food. It's the same kitchen, staffed by the same people. You can move a chef from a traditional bistro to a to-go and vice versa, and it's the same recipes. We share technology. They're managed by the same multi-unit managers, which makes the model really work, right? You can guarantee quality and you can guarantee consistency. So separating the business would kind of go against what's making it work. So it's not in the plans. It's gonna remain co-managed and cohabitated here in Scottsdale. In terms of going public or capital plans, that's still under conversation. PF Chang's once upon a time was public and went private in 2012. So it has a history in the public markets. It's kept a lot of the infrastructure in terms of the reporting standards, et cetera. So it's something that's a viable alternative. But we'll watch and we'll see, and we'll continue to manage the business and see what comes going forward.
What's the biggest change in the real estate space as a result of the pandemic that stays with us? Is it just that real big jump onto digital platforms? It was interesting during the pandemic, Damola, that there were upscale restaurants that would never do takeout that all of a sudden were doing takeout.
Sure, yeah. A lot of folks are forced to learn. Again, fortunately, it's something we knew how to do coming into the pandemic. It had been an area of focus for us. You mentioned I used to work at Partners Paulson, so I was part of the I led the transaction to acquire PF Chang's, and so that was part of our thesis when we bought the company, was that off-premise was going to be a key part of the future. It was going to drive growth. So we spent a year kind of building out the infrastructure. So it's been part of our core thesis prior to COVID, and that's really worked out, obviously, even though nobody saw COVID coming. But we did have the infrastructure in place to allow us to transition guests to off-premise pretty seamlessly.
Did you look at a lot of did you look at a lot of different restaurants? And if so, why did you choose this model or this company or this brand?
It's an incredible brand. So first of all, there's a couple of things that are very difficult to replicate. Number one is the strength of a brand, and you mentioned Nike and their performance today, but that's an incredible brand that's going to keep growing because it's got a meaning to consumers that's hard to recreate or duplicate or break, as long as they're smart about their product and their positioning, which they are. And so that's something that P.F. Chang's has, right, is the brand name, the resonance. It means something. It really pioneered Asian American cuisine here in the United States. It's got a history. So we love that. We thought there were things we could do in terms of the experience in the restaurants to make that, to improve that, right? So the food was great. It scored really well. We thought we could make the restaurants a lot more fun, to be frank, right? So we spent a lot of time, remodeling the restaurants, investing in the guest experience, theater at the table, we call it, but making dishes exciting, fun, and things like birthday celebrations, sparklers. So we've done a lot of things to kind of bring the life enthusiasm back into the restaurant, maintain the super high quality of food, and that's resonated really strongly with the guests in the restaurant. And then in addition to that, we observed, off premise and the growth that was happening in that channel, and we thought this was a perfect, type of food for off premise. Chinese takeout cuisine is something that has been part of, American culture again for a long time. And there was work to do in terms of the technology, in terms of the infrastructure, building an app, which, we didn't have when we bought the business, the website, et cetera. But we did all that work, fortunately, prior to COVID, which has allowed us to not only improve the experience in the restaurants, but also improve our off-premise business, and then launch this new concept, P.F. Chang's To Go, which, again, has been met with a great deal of enthusiasm everywhere that we've opened it.
And what happens to the bistro model?
We're going to keep opening those as well. So those have done really well. During COVID, we do off-premise out of the bistro restaurants, and we do dine-in. So there's going to be a future for opening more of those. We actually have one opening in Houston in a couple months. We have one opening in Hawaii and Honolulu. So the plan will be to open bistros, open to-goes, and let the guests choose how they want to interact with us, right? If they want to come in and have a meal in the restaurant, we're there for them. And if they want to order to go from our restaurant or from one of our P.F. Chang's To Go's, we're available for them as well.
Damola, does the to-go model for people to ordering for home or for takeout, does that help? Do you see a clear line, since you guys are tracking what's going on with your customers directly? Do you see that helping fuel the bistro model? Or vice versa?
They work well together, absolutely. So we'll have markets that have both. And the thing is it's all about brand resonance and people seeing P.F. Chang's and having it be more top of mind. So having more units, having more cars with the P.F. Chang's, car toppers, being more available and more ubiquitous in a market is a good thing for the strength of the brand, right? And so, I mentioned Dallas, that's where we're opening it To Go next week, but we'll have restaurants, we'll have to-go's, and we'll be just more present and more available from more places. You might have a guest who could have ordered it at home but couldn't from work because where their office is located, but now they can because there's a to-go in that market. So they're able to interact with us more often and as much as they'd like, and they'll think about us more because we'll be more present.
All right, so what keeps you up at night? The restaurant space is a tough one, as you know. I mean, are you guys profitable in what you're doing? And just got about 40 seconds left.
Yeah, no, we're doing very well from a profitability standpoint. We got a lot smarter operationally during the crisis. You mentioned something to the effect of never waste a crisis, but we did get a lot smarter and a lot more efficient, and that's paying off now because as sales rebound, we're more profitable than we were pre-COVID. In terms of what's been a struggle, staffing's been a challenge throughout the industry. I think that's something I'm sure you've heard from other folks in the space.
Oh, right.
We're working through it.
Yeah.
And that's something where you have to be as good an employer as you can, but it's something we're working through, but certainly a challenge.
Just quickly, 10 seconds. Are you having to pay workers more to get them in?
We've always been at the higher end because our food's more complicated and it's more work, frankly, to work at one of our restaurants and some other places. So we've always been competitive. What we're doing is focusing on making the job, as easy for them as possible. So giving them technology and tools. And making sure they have time to spend with their families. We gave them 4th of July off this year.
Is that yes or no, though? Are you paying more, just quickly?
Wages have gone up, absolutely.
All right, going to leave it there. Great conversation. Come back and talk more and let us know how it's going. We're talking with Damola Adamalik, the CEO of P.F. Chang's. Have a great weekend, everyone. A safe one. This is Bloomberg.